We're going to make a start now, everybody. All right. How many people were in there?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's the first time. Am I good to go? Am I good to go?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this special overview and scrutiny coordinating committee to take evidence and consider questions for senior officers of the City Council from a variety of departments on exempt accommodation. This is a hybrid meeting, the first one that I've chaired, given what happened at the City Council earlier this month when somebody tested positive for COVID-19. So some councillors are with me today and welcome, and some are online, and I hope you will bear with me. If you want to ask a question, those that are online, I think you can ping Emma and she will tell me, and then I will call you in. Yes.
Thanks, Carl. I think it is quite important. After last week, I spoke at another council shortly after that meeting. They were concerned because obviously they were aware that contacts were declared. So just for everyone in the room, they had to do it then. So that I have taken a PCR test since that meeting, and I have been found to be negative. And I did a lateral flow last night, and that was negative as well. So you can rest easy.
I'm assuming you and that everyone's done that.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you. Just some notes at the start of the meeting. Apologies. I've got apologies. Well, they're apologies, but they're here remotely. That's Councillor Marion Khan, Narinda Kuna, Mohammed Aklak, Liz Clements, Deirdre Orwell, Debbie Clancy, and Penny Holt. And I think you know how to get in touch with Emma in order to participate in the meeting, and I'm going to try and make it as smoothly as possible. Just a background to the information. It was started last year following discussions with the previous housing cabinet member, Councillor Sharon Thompson, and we've taken evidence from between 80 and 100. It keeps on increasing because we're still getting people writing in now from residents groups, and of all the inquiries that I've been involved in, and I've been on scrutiny since its inception, this has been the most popular in terms of numbers of submissions from local residents. So we've clearly captured the mood of local people here in Birmingham. We've seen such a tremendous rise in the number of exempt accommodation around the city. And it's that impact on local residents and local communities that's been our chief focus. There are, of course, other elements to it, not least how we support vulnerable people living in exempt accommodation, who clearly, in some cases, in a lot of cases, aren't getting the support that they clearly need. So today's meeting is basically to put those concerns of local people to key officers and to test some of the beliefs and assumptions that officers and cabinet members have made as to why we have reached this situation. And just people have asked why coordinating and not housing. It's because, as you can see from today's meeting, we've got planning, we've got housing benefit, we've got housing itself, all of which report to different scrutiny committees. So we thought coordinating was the best one to pull this evidence gathering and research into place. And my final thing, there's me going on, is to say that timing is tight, so please be brief. And I will try and keep to the timetable. We will have a break at 11:05, and there is a cafe downstairs. So, you know, we understand that it's a long meeting, so we will need a break. Okay, that's it from me. I would now like to welcome Councillor Shabrana Hussain, a Cabinet Member for Housing and Homes, and Julie Griffin, Managing Director for City Housing, who's going to do a brief introduction from their perspective. So over to you two.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to just highlight that I am joining hybrid. I'm not obviously in the room with you all. So, right. So, good morning, everybody. And I'll be very brief, like you said. Although, you know, I'm very new at this portfolio and I'm really passionate about all the issues that are around exempt accommodation around the city. The impact for some residents also have good value of good quality accommodation of this type. Some are or most of are vulnerable in the city. I'm equally committed as my predecessor, Councillor Thompson, as he mentioned, in driving up standards and tackling poor provision, and I will continue my very best to lobby with the government to ensure that the progress with the regulatory reform is needed to help councils such as Birmingham to have a proper oversight and powers to improve standards in our city. Briefly, I do welcome the scrutiny review work and want to thank everyone involved, the residents who have played a part in feeding in their views and ideas, and we will continue working with the groups across the city. And I'll take forward any recommendations coming out of the scrutiny review. Thank you.
Thank you, Shabana. Julie, have you got anything to add?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good morning to you all. And I'm also joining hybrid. So I'm the Managing Director for City Housing for Birmingham City Council. What you'll hear today is that exempt accommodation is actually really cross-cutting across the local authority. And despite the lack of regulatory powers that we actually have, there's some immense amount of work that's underway and has been underway for a couple of years. We have a number of forums internally, and we're actually in the process of completing a strategic needs assessment, which will then inform our supported housing strategy, which will go out to extensive consultation, and that will be a partnership approach, and also our approach to how we will deal with the exempt accommodation moving forward corporately and from a partnership approach. You'll also see today about how our pilot and that multi-agency approach that's been taken across community safety, adult social care, housing and benefits is actually having some significant impact on the way that we actually deal with poor landlords. I must stress that there is a number of absolutely excellent exempt providers out there that provide much needed accommodation for vulnerable households. However, what we want to do is to make sure that we drive standards up and that we ensure that those that are not actually providing good quality accommodation and the support that's required, that we actually use our enforcement powers where we possibly can and try to drive those up. I'm also really keen to continue our work, and we're very committed to our work with our residents group. We've had a number of meetings with the residents, and that's really working well, and we're going to continue to do that. So I won't go on too much more because obviously there's a lot of work that's going to be discussed today. But again, I want to be able to, out of this, the report that comes out of this, the recommendations, we will obviously drive forward internally and externally. So thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. That's echoing the committee's views. We want to tackle this problem to see what powers we've got, whether we're using them, see what other powers we need, and to create a series of recommendations for both locally and nationally that will begin to improve the standard of the accommodation, and, as you say, improve the standard of support for some of those people who aren't getting it at the moment. So thank you very much indeed. I'd now like to welcome Calvinda Coley, who's the service lead, to look at the background and context for why we've had such an explosion in Birmingham. And you've got 5 or 6 slides, and you've been allocated 15 minutes, Calvinda. So your task is to keep within that time scale. So over to you.
I will do my level best, Councillor. Thank you very much. What I'm also going to do is I may have to switch my camera off. I'm just a bit worried about being dropped off the call mid-presentation, if that's okay with everybody. Right, so what I wanted to do is just to kind of kick off with a bit of background, a bit of intro, but also give you some kind of initial findings from our needs assessment work that is currently in progress. This work is being led by Adult Social Care Commissioning colleagues as part of our cross-directorate contribution to this important issue. It's also important to note that we do still need to undertake some further analysis and stakeholder engagement before formulating the supported housing needs strategy, which Julie mentioned. So we just want to spend a little bit of time getting this right for the city, and also ensuring that the document has the appropriate read across and alignment to other related strategies that are under development, namely around the private rented sector, the housing strategy, and also the homeless strategy review and refresh. The work that has been completed so far has provided the council with the level of insight of the exempt sector, both in terms of the providers themselves, but also some understanding of what the needs are in this space and how the current provision is being used to meet some of those needs. And what we want to do is reach an understanding for the city in terms of obviously the level of need in the city, and what supported accommodation and provision might look like in terms of meeting that need. But I thought it'd be useful to just kick off with some definitions around exempt, because this can be quite a confusing and all-encompassing term. So the exempt sector has become the common term used to describe supported housing. The vast majority of supported housing is funded through exemptions to housing-related costs as set out in the housing benefit regulations, hence the term exempt. It's also important to understand that these are for housing costs only, and therefore the support has to be funded from elsewhere. In some instances, this is commissioned by the local authority. A small proportion is also funded through the voluntary sector, but our recent provider survey returns indicates that a significant proportion of the support is funded is through self-funding by individuals, i.e. their personal income. Where support has been commissioned, the provision is referred to as commission supported housing, and where it's not, it's referred to as non-commission supported housing. And as we all know, the sector in the city comprises of both. Next slide, please.
Just to say, sorry, there will be a small delay on the slides. So
okay, I thought I'd frozen. Brilliant, thank you. So we're often asked the question why such a growth has occurred in the way that it has. There's a number of related contributing factors to this. What we will be doing is elaborating upon these as we work through the various presentations from colleagues, but I just want to highlight the main things here. So the roots of the growth can be tracked back to disinvestment and deregulation, reductions in budgets for key vulnerable people, such as substance misuse, mental health, people at risk of offending, and also the removal of the old supporting people ring-fenced grant. This is coupled with reductions in regulatory powers and resources and agencies. I'm sorry, my screen is just completely frozen. I don't know if that's happened to anybody else.
Yes, it has for us as well. We'll sort it out. Carry on.
All right, I'm just going to have to call up my own slides because I can't see that now. So if you just bear with me, so I've got something to read off. Okay. So as I said, this coupled with the reduction in regulatory powers, resources and agencies has arguably led to the residual sector being left to explore how best to meet the demand that was there and the demand that's grown since. Also to note that the previously decommissioned supporting people services have reappeared through this route, and the lack of national guidance and current regulations has made it very easy to enter the market and meet the current requirements. It's important to note here that therefore the local authority has no control over this. There's a large private sector in Birmingham, and its stockpile lends itself very easily to house conversions. We've also got structural issues within the housing sector in the city, particularly pertaining to single person accommodation. Access to social housing is limited. The local housing allowance shared accommodation rates are low, rendering much of the private sector inaccessible to many on low incomes. And therefore, the housing options for low income single persons are extremely limited, pushing people into that supported accommodation as their only option. And in that space, the thresholds of demonstrating a support need within the HB regulations is very, very low. Now, we also know from our research that Birmingham is an outlier in growth in terms of this space to date. But we are beginning to see increases in other local authorities up and down the country, and we believe that this trend currently is likely to continue, so it's not just a Birmingham issue. I take it we've still not got slides up, but shall I keep going?
Yes, please.
Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to move on in terms of the methodology behind our initial needs assessment work that's been underway. So the methodology we've applied includes the use of primary research, utilising various data sources that are available to the local authority. So national population pattern and trend data, for example, provider surveys, homelessness data, commissioning data, and other insight data such as antisocial behaviour, crime and probation data. We also undertook some secondary research via stakeholder subgroups, so a mix of provider types in there, including commissioned and non-commissioned providers. I'm just going to highlight three preliminary methodology findings. So the current model of exempt accommodation provision has, as you would expect, significant impacts upon both the local authority and vulnerable citizens. The population projections and data suggests that needs will grow for this type of accommodation, and we know that the non-commissioned exempt sector is the prominent type to be able to meet those needs. The need is in the main around accommodation with low-level support needs, but we do know that there are people with greater levels of need in that provision as well. And 93% of the provision is within the oversight of the regulator for social housing, which makes the regulator the primary regulator of provision, of supported provision. However, their focus of regulation is limited to financial viability and governance. There's actually no focus on the quality of supported provision. And we do know that, that there's a number of providers identified as experiencing some sort of regulatory difficulty in that space. Okay, are we back onto the slides? Yay! Are they moving? I'm now on to, if you could just move on a little bit.
Just carry on, they're okay.
Okay, brilliant. So what you will have, if you're able to see it, is a set of diagrams which starts to break up the sector in terms of our findings, in terms of types of provision. So what we've identified so far is there are 21,317 units in scope, an estimated of which 20,000 are non-commissioned support. So the 19,760 units equate to 93% in scope provided by registered providers. We think that of that provision, circa our best guesstimate is around 6% of that is commissioned. Of the 21,317 units, that ranges from sort of medium to minimum to medium levels of support. There's also circa 968 units which are out of scope of this analysis, and that's because they provide lifetimes at homes or high support and care provision, so things like sheltered housing for provision, that type of thing. And then also some of this provision has been classed as other, and if you're wondering what that means, then that's supported housing provided by things like community interest companies. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to our findings and observations. So registered providers are the vehicle by which the welfare system is accessed. So property, tenancy and support services are in the main not delivered directly by the registered provider. So there's no direct relationship between the citizen and the registered provider. And what this enables is a significant sums of money to be transferred to third-party entities, some of which are profit-making organisations. Our research indicates that a significant number of units may also be designated as non-social housing. So by implication, therefore, not-for-profit registered providers are able to access enhanced housing benefit payments to fund a private sector portfolio. So currently, there's no oversight or regulation of the private sector portfolio. And what there is limited and does not include rent, property, tenancy or value for money. There have been concerns raised by the National Housing Federation, who recently report changes to the membership. In response to concerns from members, they quote, "We believe that some of these providers of exempt accommodation are operating a for-profit despite their official not-for-profit status, and which does not align with the National Housing Federation values." So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about the impacts for citizens who reside in this provision. So what we've got is a situation whereby vulnerable people on low income are essentially paying for their support without any form of means test around affordability. Now, this is important to note because if you look at the rest of the social care system, there is a means test in terms of determining a person's ability to pay. So this is the only support provision that doesn't do that. So there's an inequity there. In terms of the accommodation itself, this is shared accommodation, and residents have little or no influence over who the other occupants are. There's a likely churn in the sector where it's difficult to exit the sector without the appropriate support and information. What this means by implication is there's risks of vulnerable people being pushed into destitution. And with that, potentially the worsening of people's health and well-being without the appropriate levels of support. Longer term impacts, certainly, as people's needs may escalate in terms of more costly statutory interventions, such as social care. And that's before we even start to talk about the impacts upon vulnerable communities based upon where these portfolios are currently delivered across the geographies in the city, and the socio-economic challenges of those communities that exist already. And then if we go on to look at the impacts upon local authorities, there's a number of impacts there, but what I'm going to do is just kind of cover some of those off. So little influence on entry, expansion or exit from the sector, or indeed the standards of the sector, little influence over referral routes, the delivery of support requirements for individuals, coupled with no national funding for support, and also limited capacity and resource for local authorities to retain a level of oversight and scrutiny of the non-commissioned exempt sector. So if we move on then to, so if that's the situation, what could the alternatives be? And I think it's important to note that when weighing up the options, there are potential consequences and risks. So if we continue as we are, do nothing, it means it requires individuals to continue to pay for their support without means testing. The risks of vulnerable individuals going into destitution, poor compliance with regulatory standards, and currently inadequate systems and safeguards through a lack of join up between regulatory frameworks. Now, if we do place conditions on use, there's potential consequences around that as well. So it further restricts housing options for single person households. There's still a potential for providers sourcing demand from outside of Birmingham, and also potential increases in rooflessness. Now, what I'm not going to do is cover off any recommendations at this stage, because we want to do that at the end of the presentations, but I just want to give you a couple of reflections, interim reflections in terms of this phase of work. So, you know, we're of the view that need for this type of provision is likely to increase. It is largely an accommodation need with low levels of support, but although we do know that there are some individuals with higher support needs that are being placed in this provision, and without the appropriate levels of support interventions, these needs may tip into statutory interventions. What the needs assessment will do is start to compare the need versus the current supply. So we get a better feel through a supported housing strategy in terms of what the requirements are for the city. And obviously, I'm hoping you've concluded from this part of the presentation that we will need a review of the current government requirements, regulations and definitions if we are to remove some of the ambiguities which has enabled the continued growth. And I know that David is going to cover some of this off in more detail as we get to his presentation. So thank you. I will stop there.
Thank you. You've scheduled to finish at 10:30, Calvinda, and thank you very much. I should say that Calvinda is service lead from Adult Services, so that's another part of the local authority that's involved. It's excellent presentation. Thank you very much. We'll move rapidly on to look at the housing perspective, and we've got Guy Chaundy, Housing Partnership Manager and the Pilot Lead. So over to you, Guy.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll continue talking in advance of the presentation coming up. I think my bit of the presentation is very much sort of picking up on perhaps what Julie alluded to in terms of trying to talk through some of the work that we have been doing and some of the outcomes, primarily stemming from the fact that we were awarded or invited to bid for and became a pilot authority alongside 4 others. So I suppose just quickly to sort of outline what the thinking was behind the pilot and what the desired outcomes were. And they were primarily framed around 6 key themes. One is around looking to improve property and standard accommodation in Birmingham through the rollout of quality standards, but also establishing a multidisciplinary team to do some targeted inspection activity in the sector in Birmingham. 2, to ensure citizens are safeguarded and supported so that they can build their capacity and autonomy in this accommodation. And that again is linked to both the Charter of Rights and the quality standards, which I'll talk about in a bit. Obviously, Cal's talked about the pilots allowed us to fund and resource doing a proper strategic needs assessment and then develop a strategic plan, a supported housing strategy for what the future of supported housing should look like in the city. We included an element around investigating organised criminal activity based on some anecdotal evidence we had at the start of the process, and I'll come on to that shortly. And obviously the key thing, you know, enabling us to sort of do this intervention and oversight work, it will provide us with a really good sort of evidence base with our work with the government to evaluate the issues and inform that future policy thinking at government level. So I'm not going to go through each of the lines on this, they look quite busy slides, but I mean, just wanted to pull out some highlights of some of the work that we've done. And I think the key thing, and the main sort of positive thing that's come out of this, right from the start of the pilot, was we were able to bring together all of the disciplines that we talked about in the council into one sort of operational tasking forum. So that included housing, included community safety, West Midlands Police, adult social care, benefits service, planning enforcement team, who were working and literally meeting at one stage twice a week to review individual cases. So as a partnership level, there's been over 350 of those cases that have been going through that process. And that has, enabled us to share information. So where we've inspected a property and found there'd been an issue about property condition, but then when we get there, we find there's an issue around the quality of support, we've been able to collectively respond to a range of those issues. So collectively, the inspection team have done over 430 property inspections. Primarily, that has led to increased property condition standards through intervening where hazards exist, and obviously some big, larger properties that have been subject to more formal review have been targeted. Following the start of the pilot, it was clear that planning, and I know James is going to talk about some of the planning issues, but we quite early on recognised the need that planning is fully integrated in the pilot, and we've enabled them to sort of resource doing more increased investigations. There are over 200 investigations to date, but I won't steal James's thunder on that. Obviously, the key thing that we wanted to do through the pilot was to look to create some consistency around quality of provision, and primarily driving that through the rollout of the quality standards, which we developed initially jointly with BPSC. Now we've got sort of 179 Red Plus registered providers that are being targeted on this, and we've got 60 managing agents. I think Cal described that relationship between the registered provider and those third-party agents, we are seeing an increased number of those wanting to be part of the quality standards. We've got 4 big providers that are currently awaiting final sign-off and accreditation. So it's quite a lengthy process in terms of both putting in your expression of interest, doing the self-assessment, and then the external assessment. To try and sort of enhance the buy-in from the sector, we had a provider event in August, and we had over 100 attendees representing a large section of the sector in Birmingham. Supporting that, we'll be soon rolling out a training programme for providers, which is mainly focused on providing them with the tools they need to be delivering a consistent quality service, and that will be around the housing benefit regulations and the requirements, the quality standards and the charter, and other areas around community safety and how they manage antisocial behaviour. The inspection team has been, I think, very positively received locally, and we've had very positive feedback that we've been able to provide a resource to go and undertake on-the-ground inspections, which we previously weren't able to do. And that has given us a lot of learning that we've been able to feed back through our regular returns to, I will call them MHCLG still, and I'll come on to the work that we're doing with them in a bit. I'm not going to go over the housing benefit review team much, because that day is going to cover that in detail. But just as part of the pilot, it's enabled that team to enhance its capacity to do more work both at the start of the process, but also ongoing reviews and some positive outcomes, which Dave will talk through a bit. And on the support side, clearly one of the key sort of outcomes that the pilot activity was to improve the quality of support. So we brought in 2 social workers that worked alongside the team, going in and actually doing those face-to-face support reviews with individuals. And I think what that highlighted and what we've fed back is clearly there was inconsistencies around how supported care plans were being done by understatement by the organisations, and their own admittance sometimes that they didn't have the skills that that they wanted. So hence the training programme is going to be a good tool. And I think the work that the social work team have done with providers, we've been able to 240 of those support reviews, has been welcomed by a number of them. The pilot has allowed us to build on some work that we were doing within the homeless transition team to focus solely on working with those going through the homeless route coming out of the exempt sector. So over 108 individuals have been supported coming out of or going into exempt, because we still place into good quality exempt through the homelessness route, and they do that follow-up support to make sure that they're able to sustain and they're getting what they need. That's been quite a valuable piece of work. So I think the next is just to talk about the Charter of Rights, and I might bring Dom in here because he can sort of talk about this a lot more eloquently than I can, because spring housing is clearly one of the key drivers behind this piece of work, and taking it through both piloting it through the offender, and we've got a lot of in-progress adoptees to the Charter.
Dom's going to do a session after the break, so I don't want him to have two sessions.
So I suppose you've got two hats on today as a partner, but also because they kind of developed this work. And I think the key thing about this is this was developed with people with lived experience. So it was talking to people that are living in this accommodation to understand what it is they need to, and those things on the line, to have that right to feel safe and protected, decent living conditions, about really being clear that they understand what they should expect in terms of the provision, because a lot of the time people don't. They're going into this accommodation and they don't know what they should expect from their provider. And this was very much focused around giving them the tools and the information to enable them to raise concerns where they were already there. Dom, was there anything you wanted to add to?
No, I'll pick it up in my presentation.
Thank you, Dom.
So on top of all the sort of on the ground activity, there's been a lot of stuff going on that's been part of the pilot that I think is important to know. Carol's talked about strategic needs assessments and the future strategy, which I think is going to be the key for us here. So pulling together all of the evidence coming out of the work we've done on the pilot, pulling together what's coming out of this piece of work with the scrutiny review, and obviously the external evaluation piece that's being driven by an organisation called Kantar, who are working with MHDLG on the national pilot. The data analysis work will continue, and we need to make sure that we are building up that sort of data and intelligence around the sector. As I say, the draft supporting housing strategy will be a key document, and we're hoping that will be out to full consultation during the early part of the winter, and hopefully we're keen that we want to get this right rather than do it quickly. I think it's the key. We want to make sure the supportive housing strategy really sets out where the sector is going and what we can do and what we require to tighten up areas around regulation. You're probably aware that there's been a number of providers that have been coming out of the sector and exiting. We're starting to see some reactions from providers in terms of the oversight work, both from us, the regulator, etc. And we were acutely aware of the risks associated with providers exiting the sector and the need to have some quality oversight and joint working in places to manage those risks. So we commissioned a piece of work to develop a protocol and a toolkit, which has been developed along working with those providers that are going through this process and are continuing to do, so that ourselves, the regulator, the provider, their agents can safely manage any transition from one provider to another without any potential fallout around homelessness. I mentioned we had an element around antisocial behaviour and organised crime, and media should be here, but I'll just give a few sort of highlights on that. If there are any specific questions around that,
She's not remotely.
Right, okay, so
Is she?
she was going to sign in remotely, so, but if not, that's fine. I think I can cover off. But what this enabled us to do was to increase the capacity of the community safety team. So we brought in dedicated ASB officers that were working as part of the multidisciplinary team alongside those through that operational tasking to target, which, in the main, a lot of the inspections were based on complaints we'd received around antisocial behaviour. We know that there was a high number of complaints coming in around that. So they've been able to target those, and obviously the serious organised crime work and special case reviews. We had a seconded West Midlands police officer who's worked with us throughout this, and again, a key part of the pilot team. And they've undertaken, 230 inspections, 290 investigations either done or ongoing, and a number of formal enforcement actions, including a closure order and community protection orders. And I think what they will say as well, the benefit that multidisciplinary approach has had in terms of being able to highlight where those issues are and respond collectively.
Just to say, Guy, Amelia is on.
She can't speak because we haven't got enough time.
That's fine. It's just if there's any questions relating to
Yeah.
that. Yes, that's fine. Last slide from me really is around, the work that we've been doing in Birmingham, yes, but what it's enabled us to do is to have our sort of feet around the table with the ministry and the regulator. So we'd already got close working in place with the regulator of social housing, going back a couple of years now, when we saw the issues emerging, so that we have that ongoing dialogue around providers. What the pilots enabled us to do is to be part of that national steering group and looking to inform those policy changes that are needed, providing the evidence to support that. That steering group that is led by MFCLG also includes the regulator, it also includes DWP policymakers, and we've been focusing on sort of key elements of policy thinking around benefit, how we're managing benefit processes, and sort of putting together some best practice around that. Planning, support assessments, new providers, referral pathways. But I think more importantly, the overall policy thinking about what should supporting housing look like in the future, how should it be funded, how can we create that kind of oversight and regulation that's needed to make sure it is for people that truly need supported housing and it's providing the quality that's needed, and how, what is the role of the local authority, and how can we strengthen the role of the local authority in providing that oversight. So I think that's kind of it from me.
Okay, you've kept your time, which is excellent. Okay,
Not quite a good plan, but
okay, so there were 3 presentations, two main ones really, from adult services and from housing. We've got the benefits service and then a sort of strategic overview and then planning after the break. But members, any questions? Have we got anybody online yet? Have we got? I've got one for Carol, Guy. The changes to supporting people legislation. I was a councillor at the time, but I can't recall. What year was that when it essentially became deregulated?
I knew you were going to ask me that, councillor. I think it was around 2005 or thereabouts. Is that right, Jean, or was it a bit later?
2009.
2009. Okay.
Yeah,
2009. I want to say that to emphasise, I don't care which government was responsible, it was clearly wrong to do that. And that's why, this isn't about attacking this local authority or attacking the current government. This is about, let's try and create a situation in Birmingham that's better for everybody concerned, especially those good providers who are being tarnished with the brush of some of the worst offenders. So,
yeah, I'd just like to back that up. I mean, I'm a Conservative councillor, but the whole object here is to make sure that everybody who uses this, uses our services, etc., gets the best that they can get. I'm more than happy. The law needs to be changed, and so I'll quite happily present something myself that needs to be changed. I think there's 2 things that we need to get out of the meeting today. Because one is what do we want of government, and what can we do ourselves? Because even if the government said today that they were going to change and give us what we want, it's going to, by the time they go through consultation, do everything they have to do to get the law changed, they found time to do it. That's going to be quite a way down the track. So it's just finding this for me, the 2-pronged attack to make sure that the Birmingham City Council does the best it can do, and we can get the government to deliver the best thing for everyone, and then hopefully we'll get something that everyone agrees upon.
Yep, and just to emphasise, I've got a Liberal Democratic vote.
Really cross party. I think there's one other thing that should be in our minds in terms of what we get out today, and that is so that all councils across the city, especially those who aren't, as involved in it as people who sat on this committee, know what to do when the casework comes in. And I mean, just as an example for myself, when I had issues when the supported accommodation team started, I'd fire off requests to them and get very quick replies. Now replies are really, really slow, which I take it is because they've built up a large body then of casework. They're either slower at responding because of that, whatever. But should we be doing different things as councils in terms of tackling those problems so they arise? Yeah. So if we have that issue of what do we do as a council, as a group of councillors, that would be really helpful as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm calling people now who are remotely. The first one is Councillor Oldham. Deirdre, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. And I don't want to talk more compliments about it later, but there are just a couple of things I wanted to ask that popped up because of those presentations. At one point, they said that when they've been looking into fraudulent claims, they got the money back, a certain number. And my question on that is, were the people prosecuted? Because obviously they were making fraudulent claims. So I would like to know that more than just we got the money back, there were some prosecutions to prevent people doing it in the future or deter people from doing it in the future. And the other thing was, there was quite a lot about rights of tenants. And I do understand that these are vulnerable people and that some of them are being exploited, frankly, with not adequate living accommodation, and something about empowering them. But this scrutiny review has really come about mainly, I think, because of the number of complaints that residents in areas such as North Edgbaston and such as Scotland Green were getting about antisocial behaviour from these properties. So, and I've had some myself in my ward of people just hanging around in the street outside the house at 2 o'clock in the morning shouting. That's a minor thing compared to then burglary and other things which go with it. So I wondered what's being done about. It's all very well to have rights, but people have responsibilities as well. And if people are moving into an area, they do need to know that you can't stand outside and shriek at 2 o'clock in the morning when your next door neighbours have got to get up and go to work. So what is being done about explaining that there are responsibilities as well as rights?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. We'll take them as they come. So who wants to answer those two? I'll bring Guy.
So I'll come back on Councillor Alden's points first. So Dave will pick up, I think, in his presentation around how we manage providers that are identified as potential fraud. But I think it's fair to say that where fraud is identified, that is referred through to DWP's fraud audit. So is it SFIS or something like that? So they refer it to DWP. It's DWP funding, so all fraud goes through that team. And so Dave might
so we can't prosecute or recommend prosecution.
It would be DWP that would do that. But again, they can practice it.
Yeah, okay. We'll deal with that issue when we have the benefits.
And on the ASB, you're absolutely right. Just even prior to the pilot, we've evidenced through the pilot that there's been a lot of complaints, primarily around antisocial behaviour and the problems that high concentrations of supported housing, even on a particular road or in a local area, has on the local residents. And that's the work that we've been trying to do, targeting those providers where they've got those high concentrations of properties and working with them around ASB. It's going to be an ongoing thing and a learning thing with them. And through the training programme, we want to be doing a bit around what a good ASB policy looks like. It's important to say, however, though, it is a requirement as a registered provider, alongside what's called consumer regulations, to manage antisocial. They have a responsibility under a regulatory framework, regulated by the Regulator of Social Housing, to make sure they're managing the ASB and contributing to that neighbourhood. And that's the work that we've been doing with the Regulator's Office to highlight where we feel that organisations aren't adhering to consumer standards. I think, as Cal said, the Regulator's Office do focus very much from their perspective on finance and governance. However, the Social Housing White Paper has strengthened, it's proposing strengthening the regulator's role around consumer standards. So we're hoping that through that process, not just for regulating local authorities and non-supported housing registered providers, they'll have a responsibility around this sector as well.
Okay.
And on Councillor Hmos' point about casework, I mean, we've just about gone live to go live on the website, where we're going to try and improve the links to enable people to outside yourself, councillor, clearly will make sure you've got the routes that can to escalate where you're not getting responses to inquiries and that topic.
There may be things that we can recommend on an interim basis, and clearly that's what, because we
come direct to me if you've got specific cases.
We're doing another inquiry on customer services, and we are forbidden from contacting from officers direct. So, Guy, be careful what you say. You might get a rocket from somebody. Councillor Holbrook, Penny, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, I'm contacting you remotely, but there you go. I've just got two questions, really. You know, everybody knows that Scotland Green's got the highest proportion of exempt properties in the city. What I will say is that the exempt team that we've put together, which involves multi-agencies, has been incredibly helpful over here. And what I'm wondering is, when that funding ends, are we building a business case to put that to council to include it in its long-term financial plan? And actually, I would imagine that the cost of that would be offset by some of the higher interventions through social care and such. And also, obviously, the other side of that is that residents don't make a differential between exempt and HMO properties. So I know that we've recruited some members into the PRS team, but we don't currently have any numbers about that. So my question really is, are we going to make a recommendation that we continue that exempt team, hopefully with government support, if not through our mainstream budget?
It is my intention that that would be one of the recommendations, subject to the support of the rest of the committee. But I don't think.
My apologies. My apologies, Chair. If I've jumped ahead, my apologies.
Well, all good councillors always think to the future, Penny. So I'm not going to condemn you for that. No, but I think that's, you know, it's clearly been successful, the pilot, and I can't envisage a situation where that wouldn't continue. And we must fight really, really hard to make sure that the executive understand how important it is to the city to keep that pilot going. Okay, Councillor Kuna, you're next. Narinda.
Thank you, Chair. My question is around so in my ward we've got, it's very evident that we've got some people in either exempt or HMOs. I'm not sure which one it is, but there seems to be a very mix of people in there with different support needs, and it's very evident that some of them need very high support needs. And so if there's badly managed properties where there's a mixture of people there with different support needs, and local residents are complaining to say, well, you know, there's issues, because I've had issues in my ward where people have been sort of like, you know, there's been addictions to drugs and alcohol, and there's all sorts of issues. And, you know, we've had people sitting in the middle of the road because they're kind of unaware of, I suppose, what they're doing when they're high on drugs. How do we, I know we've got the pilot and we've got all the officers that are going out, they're looking at the properties and things, but how are we taking on board comments from residents where it's very evident that it's a badly managed property, in terms of regulating that particular property? Because what I don't want to do is I don't want to put everyone under the same banner, because as some members have said before as well, there are some very good providers, but there are some really bad providers as well. So my concern is obviously around the really bad providers, which is why obviously we're doing this whole inquiry. But how do you take on board when local residents are raising very serious concerns in the way that a property is being managed, and maybe the clientele that are in that property, they don't agree with each other because of their needs that they have.
Okay, I mean, that's an interesting question because we learned from the presentation that it's the housing social regulator who has a lot of the powers. So clearly we must have a good relationship with him or her and their team in order to do exactly what Councillor Cooler has suggested, close down those providers which are clearly breaking all the relevant regulatory rules. So in answering the question, if you could touch on how we get to close down a poorly managed, poorly run establishment.
So in terms of getting to the point of actually closing down.
Yes, I think that's the critical thing.
So, well, there's a number of thresholds for that. We've recently, people may know, there was a police-led closure order on a particular property.
Where was that? Was it North Edge Western?
I think it was, yes. I was going to give the name.
I'm well aware of it. It's safe. I don't know, I think you can give the name. It was Safe Lodge on Sandon Road.
And that came about through that joint working that we've got in place. Although it's police-led, it's very much,
critically, it was residents that had to give evidence and they were very vulnerable as a result.
Yeah. But in terms of closure orders, there's a high threshold for that. Yeah. There is you have to go through the course of that. Clearly, where we've got evidence that a scheme or is not delivering the requirements contained within the housing benefit regulations, they can cancel the claim. That won't necessarily lead to shutting down the property, but that's another route. In terms of the regulator will provide us more as a sort of holistic, if you like, them as a provider rather than individuals. If property falls under the remit of it's not a non-social housing, it is a social housing unit and it's a registered provider, the Housing Ombudsman's got a clear role to play here as well. The Housing Ombudsman is a registered provider, they're required to be registered with the Housing Ombudsman, and like us as an authority, the Housing Ombudsman can intervene.
Okay. So it's a long process.
It is. And just on the issue of...
But can just to interrupt, clearly, if we hit these poor providers in the pocket, if there is inadequate care, if they're not looking after the residents, if there's antisocial behaviour that's causing mayhem in a local area, we have the powers through our housing benefit role to stop the payments, do we not?
It's more around two thresholds. It's are they not providing all the minimal support, or if we can demonstrate they are for profit. So the housing benefit regulations are light in terms of the ability to respond to things like antisocial behaviour, etc. In fact, they don't. That they are literally those two tests, which again Dave will touch on through.
Okay. I think that's a critical point because picking up on what Ewan said earlier, it's unlikely that we're going to get, if we do get success with lobbying government for changes, we are going to be on our own for the foreseeable future. So we need to work out what powers we have and to use them in a very, what's the word, a very targeted way, a very forensic way to make sure that we're tackling the worst aspects.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether you've done any work around that, but I think it's something that I would like to see in our recommendations.
On the community safety slide, I would say there are enforcement powers that we have within the community safety team where we're specifically trying to tackle high levels of antisocial behaviour, etc. So those community protection notices, the closure orders, etc. So, but again, we need to, as Councillor Holt alluded to, make sure we continue capacity to do that.
Okay. And Simon, I should have welcomed you to the meeting because this is your first meeting since your election. So congratulations and welcome.
Thank you, Chair. So I've just got a couple of points. Okay, so first of all, obviously this type of housing is supposed to be temporary. However, due to the lack of support that some people receive in comparison to the actual need, I'm really concerned that people are just moved around from one type of, this type of accommodation to another. And are we keeping a track of the length of time that people are spending in this type of accommodation, because it is supposed to be temporary. The other thing is, do we know the figures of people who are making applications for benefit or exempt accommodation housing that have recently moved from outside of Birmingham. And the reason I ask this is my concern is around, you know, human trafficking and exploitation of vulnerable people who are being moved around, you know, from the country and moved in this way. And finally, just quickly, you know, while HMOs are subject to, you know, consultations with the public and things like obviously exempt accommodations are not considering that poorly managed exempt accommodations, you know, bring them similar problems, you know, as badly managed HMOs do. I mean, an example like me in my ward, when residents found out there was a exempt accommodation from a housing provider who was recently in the news for having one of their properties shut down because it was poorly managed. They were, you know, up in arms, rightly so, and they, you know, put together a petition of almost over 400 residents signed this petition, but they were powerless. You know, that there was nothing that could be done, and I think that's, you know, really makes the job as councillors obviously really difficult, because obviously we want to support our residents, and they're obviously their concerns are valid and they're right, because when you've got housing providers who are in the news, you know, and for all these reasons, it really does reflect a bad light, you know, on the whole of sort of social housing providers in this type of community.
I mean, I've heard anecdotal evidence that organised crime are involved in some of this type of provision. That would be useful in the light of what Simon just said.
Yeah, and then that was a specific element of the pilot with the secondary police resource. So I think alluded to there are a number of investigations ongoing around that. Because clearly, as you said, it was anecdotal evidence around things like trafficking, modern slavery, etc. And we're really keen to see to be able to go out there and try and identify where that's happening. Again, I know there are investigations ongoing.
Okay, but you can't comment on it, obviously.
No, I'm not on close to detail myself, to be honest.
Okay.
On that.
Yeah. Well, that's worrying, isn't it?
Well, my colleagues in community safety are fully aware of it.
Yeah,
In terms
no, it's not worrying that
I was going to say.
it's worrying that organised crime are involved in this sort of accommodation.
I mean, to what level? You know, I don't know. Yeah, we sort of need to think about it, but perhaps through a recommendation.
Okay, well, this is an evidence-led, and we haven't got evidence as yet, so it's anecdotal.
And just to respond to the point around, you know, how long people are staying in this accommodation, the fact that they move around, you know, we're looking to get that evidence through the needs assessment piece that Cal's alluded to. But yeah, through our inspection work, we're seeing that there is a kind of a regular move around when we're just trying to.
Okay. Councillor Clancy's next. Debbie, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. You just picked me to the post because I was going to ask about the housing benefit element. Because a while ago, Chair, you probably remember, we were circulated the analysis of the accommodation market in the West Midlands police area. So I've got the report in front of me, and it says here, I've highlighted it, that evidence suggests that the highest rate for support and housing benefit is easier to acquire in Birmingham than any of the other local authorities. And I suppose it just sort of revolves around your question, why can't we stop it? I mean, in my mind, the simplicity of it is, and it is simple, I know, if you keep feeding the sharks will come back. I just want to go back on that note to something that Calvinda talked about in the slides, because very quickly we ran through, the slides went off screen. I know we've been emailed them. She talked about a 93% figure. 21,317 units, 20,000 uncommissioned. I think part of what we need to do for Birmingham, because looking in this West Midlands police report, there's 184 million profit nationally from this system, this operation, criminal based or whatever. The revenue is huge. So I just wanted to know whether that's in the pilot work. I don't know. Just drumming it down to Birmingham, what sort of revenue? I think we need something in the report that's deeper, because I just want some clarity around what is Birmingham, what's the figure about units that Birmingham's dealing with, and who do we know who they are? Because in the papers we were sent before today, the call for evidence response, on the back page, it talks of 6 providers. And it says 70% of those providers make up for Birmingham. I think I've read it right. So if we know of 70% of the sector, who's covering it, what money are they being paid? Surely we need to target that section of those providers we do know and hit them where it hurts. I know that's a general overview, but you know, I'm being thrown figures here, 70% in the sector we know of. But I know we need a good overview, but I think we need to drill down a bit deeper into detail. Maybe not today, but I'd like to see something in the recommendations that shows a little bit more detail. Exactly how much is Birmingham paying out in housing benefits? How much do we know who we're paying to and how much we don't? Because we need to target the sharks.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Okay.
Chair.
We've got housing benefit presentation later on, so hopefully they made a note of those questions and we'll refer to them.
But can Calvinda come back to me on these figures?
Yes, Calvinda, can you come back on the elements relevant to your presentation, please?
Okay, so I'm not able to come back on the housing benefit figures, Councillor. So my presentation was an overview. So I'm hoping that David can help with that when we come to his piece. In terms of who's in there, again, you know, this is based on HB claims. This is a non-commissioned exempt sector. So therefore the routes into that isn't necessarily or least likely going to be through local authority routes, i.e. local authority referrals. So it could be a number of agencies that are referring into them. What we do have is a feel for, we're starting to get a feel for the types of needs within that provision, hence why I said that we started the needs analysis. We've got a bit more work to do in terms of that level of information. We do have a social work team as part of the pilot. So where we do have concerns about vulnerable individuals, we are able to go in, identify their needs, determine if there needs to be a care assessment and how we respond to that as well.
Okay, all right. And just following up on that, we have heard stories, evidence of people from outside Birmingham being housed through exempt accommodation in our city. You will obviously have a needs assessment for the Birmingham population, but there's no way you can project any analysis of who comes in from outside the city. So is there any not controlled, or is there anything anyone can do to prevent that lifting and shifting of people with vulnerable people from one part of the UK into our city? So that the, I wouldn't say the burden of responsibility, but the level of responsibility is spread evenly throughout the UK based on the origins of people's backgrounds in terms of where they're from, etc., etc. Why is it that some of these providers are moving people to Birmingham from who've got no connection with the city? Who's going to answer? Is that a planning issue?
Sorry, Chair. No, that's Cal.
Okay, Cal.
Yeah. It's not just a Birmingham issue. It's an issue for local authorities where there is exempt growth as a result of their property profile, if you like. Can we do firstly? It's difficult to determine the level of referrals from outside of the city. We have very little means of identifying where people necessarily come from. When we look at the local intelligence on the ground, the information we have is, these are Birmingham residents. So it is difficult to validate that or quantify that. In terms of what we can do outside of changes to the regulations, which hopefully will be part of when we come to our recommendations piece, and we'll cover that off in more detail. We are in dialogue with the National Probation Service, for example, to ensure that they really look at where they're, when they're resettling prison populations, that they try their best to reconnect.
Okay. I understand. It just seems to me that if I had a family member who was struggling with any addiction, if I had a family member who had come out of prison and needed support, I want them to be close to me. I want them to be close to a support mechanism, a support network that could give that friends and family that are the best providers of that support, rather than someone who's doing it just for to get rich quick, I suppose. That's what worries me, is that people are being relocated miles from where there is family and friends that can support them adequately. Roger, you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back in because one of the ways of looking at this sector is as a very, in many cases, very badly managed, sometimes well managed, but often badly managed and very, very poorly regulated safety net for people. But what I also just wanted to ask is it also a trap for those people, in the sense that once they're in there, it can be difficult to get out? And I asked that question. I had an email earlier this week from one of my residents who's in exempt accommodation, who said that they've been stuck in the same property for 2 years, and that their landlord was telling them, don't get a job, because that will mess up the benefits situation. And therefore, I can't get a job because I can't get a good enough job quickly enough to look after my own accommodation. So therefore I have to effectively not get a job. So at least I've got some accommodation, albeit it's poor. So is there an exempt trap, like, we need to talk about the benefits that is operating, and that potentially, as at the moment we're just looking at the growth and so on, but are we potentially creating a cohort of people who are stuck in this situation, and then that becomes a bigger and bigger problem down the line?
I think in terms of responsibility, we definitely recognise the need to make sure that this accommodation doesn't become a trap for people. So the quality standards, we clearly try to set out what we expect providers to do, not just to provide the support for them, whilst they're there, but this is supposed to be a stepping stone into secure settled accommodation. So clearly we would be expecting providers to be doing that work, but you're right. We know that that we've got data that indicates some individuals are into accommodation for a long time.
Okay. I've got one more person indicated to speak. It's a second bite. That's Penny, and you'll be the last one before the break, Penny. So never.
Right, thanks, Chair. I lowered my hand in order to give you a chance to consider the opportunity. I've got 2 points really. The first one is that we need to be realistic. The reason that people are moving into Birmingham from outside is that the properties are available here, and it's cheaper for their local councils to pay for them to move here than it is for them to pay to go anywhere else. And I think we need to be realistic about that, whatever your political view is. And the second question I wanted to ask, regardless, I might have missed it earlier, and my apologies if I did. What are we doing when these exempt providers close down or lose their licenses? What are we then doing to support those tenants?
So obviously the first point obviously was a comment, but in response to the second point, I think I alluded in the presentation, we recognise that there are providers exiting and there are risks to individuals around that in terms of homelessness. So the protocol and toolkit that we've been testing with, so that the 4 providers that are going through that process, we are working very closely with them, literally at a case by case, tenant by tenant level, to understand, how, doing that risk assessment in terms of what the level of support need is, and ensuring that that those needs are being met, and all, we're linking together our statutory homeless service.
What does that mean? Does that mean that they are staying in their current property and another provider is taking over, or does that mean that they're being made homeless?
It could be a range. It could be the staying in the property. It could be moving to another property, to another provider. Clearly, there is a need for us to look at them from a homeless perspective. We're making sure that we're picking that up early and up front. So it could be a range. It could be a range of outcomes that could come for each individual. Clearly, what we're trying to do through the protocol is to make it a more,
Okay, so we're dealing with it as a preventing homelessness situation.
Yeah.
So I think it's an important point, Penny. It's one that Shabrana's predecessor, my ward colleague Sharon Thompson, used to go on and meet a lot. That it's one thing dealing with the worst excesses of exempt accommodation, but then there's what do we do with the people? So I think it's something that we will address in the recommendation.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to labour the point, Chair, but the 4 providers have all got properties in my ward, so those residents are also those tenants are also my residents as much as everybody else who's suffering are my residents, and I want to make sure they're safe going forward. But I appreciate that. Thank you.
We are as one at this, okay? Even though my colleague from Sutton Coldfield has got 1 or 2 exempt accommodation, and, but he represents not just his own ward, like us all on this committee. We represent the whole of the city. So rest assured that we understand that Stockland Green has the largest percentage. I thought it was North Edgbaston. There you go. I didn't think it could get any worse than my ward. How little I knew. Okay.
No, I've got 337. If you can beat that.
Okay, all right. I'm not going to have a competition with you.
I'm only joking, Chair. I'm only joking.
Now we're going to reconvene. We're going to have 10 minutes, I'm afraid, rather than the 15 that was originally planned, because we are running a little bit behind. So can we get back here for half past 11 already? If we can get back for 11:30, have a cup of coffee. I wish I was at home. I could just go downstairs and make myself one. I'm going to go to the cafe. Who knows what the quality is like? Anybody had one from here? It is good. It is good. Okay.
The stress of being a councillor.
See you at 12:30. Sounds very good. So is Councillor Jones on the, is she?
She's
Yes, Councillor Jones, welcome, Councillor Jones. Bridget, Deputy Leader of the Council, responsible for the benefit service. We've got David Kinnair, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Where is he?
He's online as well.
Oh, sorry, you're online. And we've got Tim, everybody knows Tim Saville. Are you going to, you'll come up here, Tim, because you won't be saved for posterity otherwise. Okay, Bridget, you're going to do a brief introduction. You have, all of you have got 30 minutes, including, that includes questions. So probably 15 presentation, 20 if you must. Okay, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll be brief then. So first of all, very pleased Scrutiny are doing this piece of work. It is a huge problem in our city and hugely important that we get to the bottom of this. Benefits is very often the front door to providers landing in our city and provides a really important piece of the very, very complicated jigsaw on this. It is very, very complicated, so I'm going to pass over to the experts, which are Tim and David, to talk us through some of the issues there. I know there's been lots of challenges in the past, which the team have taken on board, investigated and looked at how we can do things to improve what we do here. And I know that the team has looked at loads of learning from other local authorities as well to look at how we can strengthen our practice. But I won't take up any more time. I'll hand over to the experts to walk you through that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Is it going to be David? Yes. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Deputy Leader. I too, I've just briefly put my camera on, but I'm too going to turn the camera off just to utilise full bandwidth and hopefully to ensure that I don't drop out or lose any form of connection. So just before I begin the presentation, I believe that the presentation will cover off a number of the questions that we've just heard this morning. However, one area which I'll go into a little bit more detail now because the presentation doesn't, so I want to ensure that I don't forget it, is around when we're talking around the reclaiming of overpayments and then the potential fraud that could be as a result of that. It was correct what Guy stated was basically it was around 2015. Was the centralisation of the fraud elements of all local authorities. So they all come under something now called SFIS, which is the Single Fraud Investigation Service, which sits within the DWP. So any form of fraud or suspected fraud across any form of benefit needs to be referred into SFIS for them to be able to deal with that. So wherever we have found or have suspected any potential housing benefit fraud, we've made those referrals through to SFIS, rest assured. And I've got those figures a little bit later on in the presentation, but I just wanted to assure you that that was actually transpiring. Secondly, with regards to the questions around cost to the city and average rent, I've got that within the presentation. But the final question I picked up on, which I didn't have in the presentation, which is the total cost of the supported sector within Birmingham. I haven't got the accurate, up-to-date figure with me at the moment in time because, as I say, it wasn't in my presentation. However, the figure is around, so I will caveat that, it is around £110 million, and our total housing benefits outlay is over £330 million. And the sector does actually comprise of over a quarter of the total of our caseload. And as the rents are slightly higher, as for general needs rents, that would correlate and appropriate the amount versus our total expenditure. Okay, so I'm going to launch now into the presentation and this element of it, and hopefully it will answer any further questions that we'd had, plus any more that you have. So first of all, with regards to supported exempt accommodation, for a claim to be treated as exempt, the accommodation provider has to provide care, support or supervision to the tenant, and the tenant must need that support. However, there is no legal definition of care support or supervision, and there is no specification about how much care support or supervision needs to be provided. Since the legislations were laid, upper tribunal have defined that it must be more than minimal. However, that doesn't always link to meeting the needs of the tenant just above minimal. The housing benefit is a payment to the citizen as opposed to the landlord. It is not a landlord's given, it is the citizen's payment. It may go in some instances directly to the landlord. However, we need to remember it is the citizen's housing benefit entitlement. Housing benefit, as well as Calvinda mentioned earlier, does not cover the cost of care support or supervision. It pays for housing related costs that can be attributed to supported accommodation. So the council must adhere to the regulations. So the regulations, as we'll come on to shortly, are limited, but we must adhere to those. We must refuse to pay, and we must, if the provision does not meet the criteria. We can restrict eligible rent and the eligible service charge, if it is deemed to be overly expensive in comparison to other suitable accommodation. So this is why cross-authority and cross-national benchmarking does take place. Can we just go back one slide, please? So I was just going off the... and we can stop housing benefit payments following a review of the claim if there is below minimal insufficient care support or supervision taking place. However, it only needs to be more than minimal, as I've stated, for us to be able to be necessary to be able to pay that element of housing benefit. Okay, thank you. So the regulation limitations. Before I go into this, I think it is also key to pick up onto a couple of points that Calvinda made around deregulation around about 2016 with regards to the regulator's powers around controlling providers operating a lease-based model, looking at borrowing, looking at those lease relationships. Now, there was unintended consequences that occurred, and I think what we need to also concentrate on is not just the limitations of the housing benefit regulation, but the limitations that occur because of the unalignment between different sets of regulations and the gaps and loopholes that can occur as unintended consequences that fall out of such gaps between the regulation. An example of that, obviously, is when the regulations were set, it was in a very different era, a very different context. A number of the supported accommodation providers were of a different model, and it was written into supporting people funding and written into contracts. That social value had to be part of the contracts and part of the delivery model. When Calvin has mentioned there the reduction of supporting people ring fence, the reduction of commission support, when that was put hand in hand with the deregulation and the lack of then control over the lease-based model, a number in Birmingham as well as the providers moved out of that area, and that led an opportunity for a different model of provision to move in, which opened the door to these lease-based models, and well funded, well supported by external consultancy groups and lawyers of investment costs, but then be able to provide this type of accommodation in a different manner. So it's also, as I say, the gaps between the legislations as opposed to just the looking at legislation in its entirety. We can't delay a payment without reason. There's been a number of suggestions that we could potentially deter providers by enforcing a mandatory delay. That's not possible. Once we have obtained all of the necessary information and evidence, we then have an obligation to make a decision within 14 days. Sometimes it takes much longer to make the decision, but that is to do with us not receiving the appropriate information or evidence. So this is why in some cases, and we'll get contact from some organisations where the decision has taken much longer, but that's because there's been a failure to provide the information that's been requested. However, once it's been requested, it's not around looking at KPI performance around the days to pay. It is actually we have a duty to pay to make a decision within those 14 days. There is also a suggestion, and that we can, and a claim that other authorities do this, that we extend and we get round that 14 days by extending our time period by paying the local housing allowance in between whilst we make that decision. That's not possible. Legislation it takes the facts that we can't do that. I believe it's Regulation 13C states that the LHA rate can't be paid for registered landlords with supported accommodation. So other authorities where have been reported are partaking in this practice, we have contacted and they have confirmed that they don't. Along the lines of the legislation, it is not possible to be able to do so. We can't refuse payment just based on the level of support if it is above minimal. It may not meet that citizen's needs if it is a very complex and all-encompassing needs. However, if it is above minimal, then it triggers the payment. If there is insufficient evidence of information provided, then we'd not be able to make a decision, and as this can lead to delays. And we can't take into account the standards of the property, any reports about antisocial behaviour, potential substance misuse, all of a lot of the other issues that's involved and can fall out of supported accommodation in some instances. However, we will refer them, and prior to the pilot would make direct referrals to other agencies, whether that be key stakeholders, agencies within Birmingham. But now obviously the pilot's underway, we work collaboratively and obviously as part of one team. So those referrals are as a given basically and go to the correct areas with regards to the referral routes for anything else that could potentially be addressed, but that sits outside of our remit. So the supported exempt accommodation team that we had in place, we towards the end of 2018 developed a team, supported exempt accommodation team, which started its reviews in 2019 before the pilot. The pilot, however, has enabled us to add extra processes to this team's functionality and also expand the volume of the reviews that can take place. So we've increased the numbers of the team. Slides have gone again, I'll just refer to mine. So we've increased the numbers within the team as a result of the pilot. So some of the new processes that we've put into place. So one of the questions, sorry, I'll just pause there for a moment. One of the questions that we were looking to address is talk through our process of the front door process of assessing a new claim. That is a very, very lengthy process, and if at the end of this presentation I have time, I'll try and skim through that process. However, that documentation, I believe, may have been sent out prior to the meeting, but if not, it will definitely be sent out afterwards, our full assessment process. But some of the new processes that we've added on since 2019 is we meet with all new landlords before any applications are even considered. There's an interview process that's part of the application form. We do full case reviews of providers of concern. So where we have providers flagged up to us that as of concern, so we do need to be evidence-based, we will then do a full case review. It's not just purely looking at the 6 largest providers, as what was just mentioned earlier, targeting those and believing they potentially be sharks, because just because they're large doesn't directly mean that they are of poor quality. So we will target where we have had providers of concern raised to us. We will also do reviews of all claims after a 2-month period. So not only when the claim first gets put through, we've instigated a 2-month review on every single claim, where we go back into that claim and ensure that there is evidence of care, support or supervision. And if it isn't, we will then end payments, take it back to the furthest point of evidence, and then reclaim that potential, that overpayment if it is appropriate to do so. A new process we've put in place is we're tracking outcomes of 50 cases where we're to see sort of any form of movement within the sector. So where we have ended supported exempt accommodation payment for 50 cases as a result of review. We're tracking those cases for 2 months to see if they are then the applications for those claim reference numbers within other organisations, and whether then we can track a form of surge around the city. We have obviously withdrew status following reviews. One organisation totality, because they moved across to become a profit organisation. We also work with the revenues, council tax department, basically, to ensure that the correct liability is being applied for supported accommodation property. So it's trying to utilise every string to the bow that we could potentially utilise, because the regulations are limited. And obviously we're working within the supported housing pilot. The outcomes, the overpayments to the value, this is it's slightly different to the figure that Guy has in the figures before earlier, is because this overpayment figure is since this team was created 2019, as opposed to the figure which was since the pilot started. So the overpayments to the value of 3.6 million have been recovered back into the city. Now, it's very important to say those overpayments occur not because of a lack of process, but because of inappropriate or fraudulently claimed housing benefit. And then those fraud referrals are then made. We have put extra processes in place over and above what is actually already existing processes to track through any potential overpayments. So basically, we have already in place something called the Housing Benefit Award Accuracy, the verification of earnings and pensions, Atlas, data match systems, matching with HMRC. All of these track through potential changes in circumstances which would then trigger an overpayment, where basically an individual, a citizen or a landlord has not followed their legal duty and informed us of change of circumstances. So we cannot do. The benefit caseload is 80,000. The council tax support caseload is 120,000. We can't do 80, and we don't do, and it's not the requirement to do 80,000 and 120,000 daily checks to ensure those claims are still accurate. It is actually the legal duty of the landlord or the citizen to inform us of those changes. When they don't, that is then an inappropriate overpayment or a fraudulent overpayment.
David, can I interrupt you? You do need to speed up.
Okay, yeah.
So just key points, really.
Yeah. So we've withdrawn, as I say, we've withdrawn SEA status, and we've made 9 fraud referrals, and we share information with the regulator of social housing. We benchmarked all of our front door process and also our review process amongst core cities, West Midlands authorities, and also through the operational group, which is the DWP practitioners group, which we're members of. So over 15, 16 authorities can list that we have benchmarked against to ensure, and this is something we did at outset in 2019, but also in 2020 and again this year, to ensure that we are utilising everything and looking at best practice. We have invited in DWP's performance development team to review and do a health check for us.
You're going no quicker, mate. You're just reading the slides. You need to just focus on the key points. You've had 20 minutes already. I'm sorry, but we need to ask you questions as well. So can you just conclude very quickly, please?
Okay, so that's why we've invited in DWP. We've part of Core Cities Focus Group, which is current focus group, which has just been set up to look at the surge in supported exempt across all core cities. And we've been shortlisted as one of 6 local authorities out of over 350 as identified as good practice within supported exempt accommodation. A number of outcomes. So you'll see this is new providers that have tried to come to Birmingham to open up new properties. Out of 390 claims, applications that have been submitted, we've refused 211, granted 62, but restricted the rent on 117. So that's to show you the new properties that are trying to come into Birmingham. The outcome of the reviews there obviously for you to see. of what we've done to date, the properties reviewed, the claims reviewed, the overpayments and the fraud referrals made. Further questions, as I say, which we've had come through, questions that have just been mentioned today and that's come through. The average weekly HB entitlement for PT, so for private tenancies, is 184, and for registered it's 217. Mid-table compared to all other authorities that responded to our benchmarking exercise. There's around 12 authorities, core cities and such, responded to that exercise. So the subsidy loss to Birmingham around that would be on the PT properties, which is around 2.6 million, and that has remained static for the past 4 years. The average cost of social rent is slightly more because not all of the rent is covered by the HB entitlement, and that's at £218. How claims are processed, obviously that's a very long process, which I'll send the documentation will be sent through. The benchmarking we've mentioned, the differences between local authorities, we've ensured that there isn't any differences in our process, and we have strengthened wherever possible. I will continue to look to strengthen the process, hence DWP. And the final point there is we had a question around where the regulator has been involved in a provider. Why do we carry on paying? Basically, if and when a provider has registered status removed, then we can look to make the review of that claim and reassess that claim. If they have just downgraded or if they started to do a review, they are still of registered status, and that is not something that we have control over or can look to actually be able to change ourselves. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Sorry if I rushed you, but we've got an awful lot to get through today. I'm going to bring in councillors now. Councillor Mackie, you and
Thank you very much, Chairman. David, just in case you weren't here at the beginning, I think we very much agreed there's a cross-party approach to this. Sort of a two-pronged attack, really. One is what can government do to make sure we get a good ask from them, and there's also what can Birmingham City Council do, because even if the government changed everything overnight, there's going to be a slight delay there. And I was sort of intrigued there, you were talking about the pilot and the things that have been done in the pilot. Some of those things I was a bit surprised that you weren't doing before. Could you sort of widen that about why some of those things it took the pilot to do them?
As I stated, we started to do them mostly within 2019 when the team was put into place before the pilot. However, the front door process was always in place, but we implemented the review process from 2019 when we identified that most local authorities don't do that. And we identified that that would actually potentially help us identify any decline in performance or decline in provision from those providers, because they initially would demonstrate to us that this was actually being provided, let's say care support or supervision, but when we revisit those claims later down the line and do a review, then we could find that that may well have changed. We did find that, and that's why we put that in place in 2019.
Okay, just building on that, I noticed on your slide that the regulation limitations, basically you say we can't do anything. And then when we come down to the review and applications over the last 12 months, you refused 211 units and you restricted 117. So if you've got no powers, as you state in the regulation limitations on the earlier slide, what powers have you got now that you're using? Powers suddenly haven't materialised. So come on, what's changed?
I don't believe the slide says we don't have any powers. The slides state that there are limitations within that. So basically, a provider needs to provide above minimal care support or supervision and be not for profit. So where we have ended claims or where we've refused claims, it's where we have been able to demonstrate that that provision, that provider has either moved from not for profit themselves to becoming for profit, or where we can demonstrate that there is below minimal care support or supervision.
Okay. So, David, We've seen in earlier presentations that there's been a dramatic increase in the number of exempt accommodation providers in Birmingham, both units and providers. Did anybody in your team pick up on that and raise it with senior managers?
The simple answer is yes. We identified the growth in the sector and started identifying that in around about 2018. And that was one of the reasons why we then started to put together this team, the supported exempt accommodation team. And in 2018, the work began around putting together the Charter of Rights and the quality standard. And we were working together at that point with key stakeholders and other areas of the council to try and develop and formulate a response to try and curb the growth, the growth.
Okay. Can you give us further information, not now, but send it to Emma by email, the reasons why the SEA status was refused and why some of them had their rents restricted? I'd be very interested to know why, but I'm going to ask you again, what has changed in the last 12 months that has allowed you to refuse and restrict claims that you weren't doing earlier? That is a critical question that this committee wants answered.
Okay, we were doing it earlier. The statistics I've given you are for the past 12 months with regards to refusing new providers coming on board. That was just to try and give a snapshot of some of the work that we've undertaken within the last 12 months. Some of the other statistics I've provided is the overpayments that have been clawed back and the fraudulent referrals that we've made since 2019. So that piece of work was being done. We've just have the capacity to be able to strengthen and widen those reviews. I'll go back to the legislation. What it allows us to do? We do restrict, and we always have restricted rent levels where possible, and we always have refused new providers if they don't meet the legislative requirements. And then we will also and always have removed payments and status if then a provider falls off the standard that's required as laid out within legislation. But we're going back to above minimal and not for profit. Okay,
I still feel that there's something missing in your answer. I'm still. There's got to be something that you weren't doing that you're doing now. I haven't got to the bottom of it. I really haven't.
Sorry, Chair. What we weren't doing, as was detailed in there, prior to 2019, we weren't doing the review process. We had the front door, but once a claim was awarded, it then wasn't reviewed after a 2-month period. As a rolling review or on a sort of a diarised review. No other local authorities were doing that at that point either. And this is something that we developed and put into place in 2019. The pilot has helped us, just given us more staff to do more and to do them quicker.
Okay. Roger.
Yeah, the question I'd like to ask is about the not-for-profit status. Because I find it very hard to believe that some of the properties that I've looked at in my ward and heard some of the figures that are being paid, that there is not profit going somewhere. And it seems to me that part of that issue is around the sort of the cluster of agencies, organisations, businesses, whatever, that are involved. So you quite often have the provider, you have the organisations that's actually looking after the property, and then you have organisations that are recruiting new tenants for that property. So my question is, has anybody actually taken the case of an individual property or a group of properties and looked at all the money that's going in terms of benefit payments and where all that money actually ends up going? Because my concern is that, yes, it may be that the registered provider can say, oh, look, I'm not for profit, but profit is being sorted away in other places, and maybe, who knows, actually finds its way back to the provider through back doors or whatever. Has that exercise of following the money been undertaken in a sort of comprehensive way per property to assess this issue of, is it really non-profit, or is it just being declared as such?
Our relationship and our payments need to be with the registered provider who are making that claim, and they are then registered as not-for-profit. Where they have tipped over into being for-profit status as registered for-profit, we have then ceased that payment and obviously then reclaimed those overpayments. Yes, that is the problem there, which you've just highlighted. The regulator are well aware of it, and it's what I sort of alluded to earlier, where saying one of the problems is the gaps, not just in regulations, but between the regulations. So our powers stop at the provider, at the landlord we pay, and they are then not for profit. They will then have a relationship, or they could then, as of you have identified there, with profit making authority, with profit making organisations. However, our powers, our limitations stop at where the payment is made. It's where the HP payment is paid. What they then do with that money then is beyond our control or our involvement. We have obviously spoken to the regulator about this. They are well aware of this, and they have informed, and they are working with DWP and MHCLG as was around this issue. And this is one of the known issues. And one of the things that I've stated, when the regs were written, it was a very different era and context, and there's been unintended consequences since some of those have been changed.
So isn't that a clear recommendation that we should be making?
Yes, definitely.
The whole, where the whole payment goes, not just the relationship with the registered provider.
Yes, definitely.
So is that for profit definition?
Okay. Is there any other councillors online that wish to ask questions? I haven't got anybody as yet. Yes.
Just a quick point. While I welcome that new applications from landlords are being reviewed and a number have been rejected, I think the majority of these type of properties in Birmingham are managed by a few already well-established housing providers, and what we need is more accountability of these providers and sort of more robust action to be taken against them where they're trying to be failing to meet standards, especially because they're supposed to be supporting our most vulnerable residents. So I welcome, anything, any information around that, if there's anything planned to include accountability of the providers.
Sorry, my audio was dropping in and out then. I don't know whether that could I just have the question, please?
It was more of a point.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, all right.
Can I?
Yes.
I think just hearing about your refusals and the things that you've done, which are all very welcome. My background is the construction industry, and I'm used to seeing the Birmingham City Council on planning was known as a softer touch than other councils, and so it didn't come as a great shock to me to hear that this is another area that other councils are deemed to be stricter on. So it wasn't a massive jump for me to sort of think that maybe something in that. And I've heard examples of claimants that were looking for approval in sort of areas of Birmingham and then being refused, and they'll be in these figures as being refused, but then they apply across the road and still within Birmingham, but just across the road, and they are then approved. So, whilst we can say we've got a big list of people who have been knocked back here, these people are still saying, okay, we just applied at another property and got it. And do you have any numbers for how many people who were refused were then subsequently approved at another location?
So I'd need to see sort of examples to be able to follow that through to see if of ones that you're aware of. We would have figures, again, not with me right now. We would have figures of provision that we initially would have knocked back because of lack of evidence, and then they would. The provider may well have put different actions or provision in place, and then reapplied, having changed various different processes that they will provide, and that may well then have been awarded. However, I would need to go back and obviously look through those figures and be able to put that together.
Okay. I could ask you question after question after question, but I think I'm going to get the same answer, David. That's not a reflection on your poor performance. That's just a reflection of the situation we're faced with, really, that there's been a massive growth. Let me put this to you then. During the course of evidence gathering, I spoke to a private landlord who's been operating for many, many years, runs HMOs across the West Midlands, and said that Birmingham is a soft touch, basically echoing what Councillor Mackey said, and that the housing benefit team have destroyed the private rented sector in Birmingham because everybody thinks that HMOs and private landlords and exempt accommodation are all the same thing. She said that Sandwell and other local authorities locally are far tougher on enforcing housing. They've got a perceived difference in interpreting the housing benefit regulations. What would you say to that anecdotal comment from private landlords in the city?
I'd like to look at it as an evidence-based question. So I'd like to see the evidence that would demonstrate that we are soft touch as opposed to an authority that is considered as not a soft touch. So the one individual I do believe I can identify where this is coming from. And the allegation that's made around Sandwell, and it always gets levied with Sandwell, is the fact that they implement a 6-month mandatory delay. And this then puts off potential applications to the authority. I have contacted Sandwell, who vehemently denied this, and has actually stated within this last financial year that they haven't turned down any supported exempt accommodation applications in 2021. From the information that Sandwell, as I say, we work with those because they're with part of the West Midlands group. It is a key concern across all of the local authorities that I talk to. This is why, as I say, there's a core city focus group, for example, being called and is happening on Monday of next week, where they're trying to look at good practice about how they can stem this flow. The anecdotal, as I say, information around soft touch, as I say, we have benchmarked all of our processes against a number of authorities that have been identified as good performers, as good practice. And every element that they carry out, we do as well. There is a bar one. There is one element that we cannot do because it is not part of the HB team as such. I mean, there is only a very small number of authorities, and they are small authorities that do that. And that is with the initial application. There is a visiting team of other areas, so social workers, etc., that go out at the initial visit. However, as part of the pilot, our version of that is those other areas of the council go out at various different review stages now anyway. Instead of it being doing at inception, it's basically now done later on as a review. And any misinformation that is then discovered as part of that, obviously then leads to the removal of any form of status and overpayment being reclawed anyway. That is the only difference between all of those authorities. So yeah, I just need to see the evidence to be able to provide my evidence as a response.
Okay. But you accept the devastation that the growth of exempt accommodation has caused to particular communities in this city, don't you?
I understand. Yes, I see that. I used to work in the sector for 23 years before coming to Birmingham City Council. I understand, and part of the issues is around the removal of social value, around the removal of various different landlords' responsibilities. And as I say, that is not something with under the housing benefit control, regulation control, but I do empathise and do understand the issues that is causing Birmingham City Council, the citizens and the local authority.
Okay, Debbie Clancy, would you like to come in, please, Debbie?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. David, I'm ever so sorry. I've missed a lot of what you've said because although I'm on mute, I can hear background voices where I am, and I can barely hear what you're saying, and I'm just getting clips of it. So I apologise because the bits I can hear, it does sound like you know your remit. Forgive my ignorance, and I just want to ask a simple question. with the housing benefits that are paid out, I know you've talked about the reviews and the refusals, but the majority of the housing benefit that is paid out, is there 100% return from DWP back on that? I'm just trying to think of the subsidy of the housing benefit regulation, and I'm no expert on it. I just thought you received 100% back of what you paid out. Have I got that right?
Okay, so for registered providers, which is where we've had the majority, well, we have had the growth within Birmingham, that is the case. The subsidy is then the subsidy payment is returned. For PT, so for private tenancies, there isn't the full subsidy returned. It is at a lower rate. However, and that depends whether then that falls into PT, whether that then falls, go again, start into complexities now. We're talking about Reg 13.1 and Reg 13.2, and they both trigger different subsidy amounts that come back into the council, but it isn't 100%. The PT caseload within Birmingham has remained around 1,100 since 2016. And it hasn't grown, so there hasn't been a growth in subsidy loss for Birmingham. However, one of the differences between Birmingham and other local authorities is a vast majority of other local authorities' growth is in the PT sector as opposed to the registered sector. So as well as all of the other issues that we're talking about here today around the problems around antisocial behaviour, around the problems it has on our local community, it is also an added problem for the finances of other local authorities, because the PT caseload is growing exponentially, which is also affecting their subsidy loss. Currently in Birmingham, and has been the case since 2016, the growth for Birmingham has been in registered as opposed to PT.
Okay, thank you.
Apologies, we don't appear to be able to hear anybody.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Councillor Council, but we can't hear the Woodcock Street Tea Rooms.
No,
BMI.
Yeah. No problem, yeah.
It appears to be on mute.
Well, Emma's off, so let's see.
I'm not going to. I just thanked you effusively, David. So I'm not going to thank you again. Tim's going to tell you what I said. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Picking up the award for the best benefits to.
Is he? Okay. Well, I was going to say something that, awards mean nothing to me, I have to say. But they mean everything to some people, I know. We've got planning now, so I've got James Fox and Ewan Fanhan from planning who are going to briefly run through their slides, because you haven't got the powers at the moment, so can you focus on what you'd like, rather than what you haven't got?
Thank you. Must to keep within the time. So, the slides.
Yeah, there will be a small delay, but they will come.
We hope.
We hope. But members have got the slides, so you can start talking to me.
Yeah, we've got them on, so go on.
But during the lifetime of the pilot, planning enforcement have investigated over 200 supported accommodation properties, building up a strong understanding of how these properties operate to determine their planning status and ultimately whether a breach of planning control has occurred. For reasons I will go into, we've found the vast majority of properties investigated do not require planning permission. In a number of cases where the quality of the accommodation has not been acceptable, informal action has been taken to facilitate improvements, including increasing the size of internal communal space for the residents, and in cases where no provision has been provided, reducing the number of bedrooms to introduce a communal living space for the benefit of all the residents, and improving the overall standard of the accommodation. Formal enforcement action has also been taken where serious breaches of planning control have been identified. 21 Sandham Road is a prime example where a former hotel was converted into a large 22-bedroom supported accommodation property, causing significant ongoing demonstrable harm to the locality and inadequate living conditions for the occupants. On the back of the pilot, a multi-agency approach was taken involving the police and colleagues across a range of council services, resulting in the police issuing a temporary closure order and a planning enforcement notice being served, which may ultimately require the cessation of the use on a permanent basis. The focus given to us by the scrutiny review has been to examine what we can and can't do within planning legislation and consider whether this allows us to stem the growth of supported accommodation in Birmingham. We have also been asked to look further at how the assessment of each property is made to see whether any changes could be introduced to provide greater control through the planning system. I'm not going to discuss the citywide Article 4 direction in any detail, as it is now common knowledge supported accommodation we're seeing in great numbers remains unaffected, as the legislation dictates they cannot be classed as C4 HMOs due to the definition of a HMO in the Housing Act. The use of a property for supported accommodation also does not have a specific use class defined in the use class order. If you can go back to the previous slide. However, based on the characteristics of this type of accommodation, we consider this use should fall within one of the three use classes listed on the slide. Those being C3B, C3C, or sui generis. To determine the use class of each property and ultimately whether the use of the property requires planning approval, the main consideration for the City Council is, do the occupants of the property live together as a single household? How this assessment is made is covered later in the presentation. However, in summary, planning permission is not required to change from a house to supported accommodation where a property is managed by a registered social landlord and is shared by 3 to 6 people living together as a single household. One of the observations in the scrutiny review brought forward guidance provided by other councils, which would suggest the use of supported accommodation could fall within the C2 use class as a residential institution. We thank the group for their findings, and having considered the guidance published by Nottingham City Council, we acknowledge the C2 use class does include uses for the provision of residential accommodation and care to people in need of care, other than in a use falling within the C3 use class. However, the use class order makes it clear that this class includes hospitals, nursing homes, residential schools, colleges, training centres, and also for the personal care of children. Based on evidence gathered throughout our investigations of supported accommodation, it's very clear that the characteristics are very different to the C2 use classes set out in the order, and providing there are no more than 6 residents living as a single household, supported accommodation is more in keeping with the C3 use class. Next slide, please. So the question remains, when will supported accommodation require planning permission? The single household concept is something you would necessarily take into account to consider the use of supported accommodation. However, from a planning perspective, there is no legal definition of what constitutes a single household. Fundamentally, whether occupants form a single household will always be a matter to be determined on a case-by-case basis as a matter of fact and degree. There is no definitive factor. Nevertheless, the very fact that C3B and C3C is restricted to households consisting of not more than 6 residents indicates that there is more likely that they are doing so as a single household than if there were more than 6 residents. In other words, the smaller the number of occupiers, the more intimate and cohesive their occupancy is likely to be, and the more apt, therefore, to describe the use as a single household. It's really important to know the supported properties that we are investigating all operate in a very similar way, providing bedrooms for up to 6 people with shared facilities and a level of support or care. Incidentally, C3B is aimed at enabling people with disabilities, mental health, or challenging behaviour to live as normal lives as possible in touch with the community. Nevertheless, what we are finding when comparing one property to another is how well, or not as the case may be, the properties are being managed, and the varying mix of tenants occupying a property at any one time. Both of these factors may in turn lead to concerns regarding the impact of the property on the surrounding area. For example, an increase in antisocial behaviour. but these are not necessarily planning considerations to assess whether the property forms a single household, and planning has no control over the behaviour of the individuals living in the properties. At this point, it's also important to highlight the strong links we have made with other service areas as a result of the pilot, which has provided an opportunity for these impacts to be addressed more effectively. This collaborative approach introduced by the pilot, including regular tasking group meetings, ensures the properties generating the greatest impact are always prioritised. Another query raised in the scrutiny review questions concerns whether the occupiers of each property have to be related in order to form a single household, and whether it is possible to revise the council definition of a HMO and single household so that planning can control properties containing occupants who are unrelated or without family ties. There are two important points to be made regarding this recommendation. Firstly, the definition of a HMO is not prescribed by Birmingham City Council, and we are unable to amend the exemptions for supported accommodation as set out in Schedule 14 of the Housing Act. Second, having sought further legal advice on the recommendation, it is quite clear that the Council's consideration of the use of supported accommodation as a single household cannot hinge on whether the occupiers of the properties are related. This is due to the wording of the use class order at Class C3 that confirms the definition of single household in Section 258 of the Housing Act only applies to the interpretation of Class C3A, as highlighted in red on the slide, on the previous slide. This interpretation does not extend to C3B or C3C, and on this basis, the relationship test and the occupiers seemingly being unrelated or without family ties is not crucial. Moreover, if we decide to adopt this rigid relationship test as per Section 258 of the Housing Act for Class C3B and C3C, it will more than likely be challenged as it goes beyond what is actually stated in the use class order. Further evidence submitted by the Perry Bar Housing Action Group from the City Council was also found to be specific to the assessment of houses in multiple occupation, and therefore, unless the definition of a HMO in the Housing Act is changed, this is not something we can apply to the assessment of supported accommodation. No. Next slide, please. So, how do we assess whether a property forms a single household? Crucially, the work of the pilot has opened up clear channels to quickly gather appropriate evidence, and using a combination of information maintained within the council and also additional information direct from the providers and our own internal inspections, the 5 factors on the slide can be evaluated. These factors are the main elements of the use that we are considering to determine if the occupants of a property form a single household, and ultimately whether planning permission is required. If the use does not meet the single household test, it will be classed as sui generis, and planning permission will be required where the change of use is considered to be material in planning terms. This guidance is also published on our website. We recognise evidence submitted during the scrutiny review appears to highlight how other councils may be assessing supported accommodation in a different way to Birmingham, which may bring more of these properties under planning control. However, having contacted other local authorities, including Nottingham City Council, it's apparent that where feedback was provided, the general assessment of supported accommodation that we are aware of would make no difference to the approach we are taking in Birmingham. I'll now pass over to Ewan, who will go on to explain how we assess properties where supported accommodation requires planning permission.
Okay, thank you. I'll just quickly go through this. So policy DM12 will apply when planning permission is required for supported accommodation, and as James has already set out when that is triggered. So the types of uses that it applies to include hostels, care homes, supported accommodation, and other forms of shared housing that's not classed as a HMO, but it can be considered sui generis. So that first criteria there is that such development should not lead to an unacceptable adverse impact on the amenity, character, appearance, parking, public and highway safety of the area, taking into account the cumulative effects of similar uses in that area. And so that last bit of that sentence is really important. Similar uses will cover a very broad range of specialist accommodation. That's basically any residential accommodation that's not family accommodation, such as student housing, such as exempt accommodation and HMOs. So the benefit of this policy is that it will apply citywide to every part of the city, and a specific threshold has not been set. So applications can be considered on a case-by-case basis. For example, there may only be like 3% of such uses in the wider neighbourhood, but within the very immediate vicinity of an application site, then there may be like 5 hostels or something. So that this policy provides flexibility to take into account the different scenarios. The policy also requires proposals for supported accommodation to provide good quality living accommodation. So that includes outdoor amenity space, sufficient parking, and it does not adversely affect on the amenity character and appearance of the area. It also requires that proposals are located in sustainable locations, accessible to local shops and services, public transport and other facilities. And in regards to conversion of family housing to supported accommodation, the scale and intensity of the scheme must be appropriate to the size of the building that it's trying to fit within. And the policy says it's more appropriately located in large detached dwellings set in its own grounds. The development of such uses in smaller detached or large semi-detached or terraced houses will not be acceptable unless the immunity of adjoining occupiers can be safeguarded. So the specific quality of the proposal and the merits and details of the individual schemes will be assessed. So as you can see, it's quite a thorough and strict policy. But as we've said in the beginning, this policy can only be applied when planning permission is required. Okay, next slide, please. So in relation to HMOs, and I know this scrutiny is about exempt accommodation, not HMOs, but it's important to highlight the planning policy on HMOs because there are linkages with exempt accommodation. And one of the questions raised through the scrutiny inquiry is, will the presence of existing exempt accommodation in the area be considered when planning or assessing HMO applications? And yes, it can be. So we will take measures to factor in exempt accommodation when assessing the cumulative impacts. The HMO policy says that HMO should not form more than 10% of the residential properties in the 100-metre radius of the proposal site. But because exempt accommodation are not HMOs, we have to identify them separately on our mapping system, but they will be considered together with HMOs when we're assessing that 10% threshold. And we are in the process of mapping all the SEA data. So any proposals for HMOs must also not result in a family house being sandwiched in between 2 HMOs or non-family residential uses. So once again, this will include exempt accommodation. And then any proposals for HMOs must also not result in 3 or more in a row being created, and that 3 in a row can include other non-family residential uses, including exempt accommodation. So this is a new policy. It's been strengthened from the existing policy significantly. But once again, DM 11, this policy can only apply when an application for a HMO is required. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to ask one first.
Yes.
An awful lot of HMOs, they just spring up without telling anyone, and they operate, for quite some time. What do you do in those situations where permission is required? There's lots of exempt around. They haven't got permission, and then councillors get notification when you go and visit, and they're basically encouraged to put an application in to legitimise what they've been doing for some time illegally.
So the citywide Article 4 obviously applies to houses in multiple occupation, putting supported accommodation to one side. Any HMO within the city would require planning application now on the back of the Article 4.
Why can't you close them down depending on the application?
So if the property is in operation as a HMO, and quite clearly then it would require planning permission, we have to make an assessment in terms of whether or not it's something we could support. So just because they're breaching planning control in terms of operating without planning permission, it's not actually a criminal offence to do that. So what we would have to assess is what the likelihood is of that property obtaining planning permission retrospectively. And in law, developers are entitled across the board to apply retrospectively to obtain planning permission. So if we find a case whereby they're operating a HMO, and we would refer this matter to the area teams from our initial investigation from enforcement, and if we're given advice to suggest that any application is unlikely to be supported, then clearly at that stage it's not worth the applicant applying for planning permission, and we would advise them of that there is a very strong likelihood.
They can appeal, can't they?
But that's it. There's obviously an appeals process, not only for the planning applications itself, but if we were to take enforcement action, then there would be an appeals process triggered as far as that's concerned as well. So we can't take away the right for people to apply retrospectively. However, clearly it's not something we would encourage. And the risk is always with the developer and the owner of the property if they choose to actually implement something without planning permission in the first place.
Okay, Ewan and then Deirdre.
Thanks very much, Carl. And I think there's families in the city screaming out for family accommodation, and it may not be a legal crime, but it feels a crime to me to have these beautiful Victorian homes turned into HMOs. I take on board what you're saying regarding planning, about exempt accommodation, etc. But a lot of these properties need conversion to get in to become exempt accommodation. Now, surely there must be something you could do around that angle, because the planning, you can see what's coming. This planning application is surely changing the use of this dwelling, so therefore. I know you have to stick by the rules, but being a bit creative, I'm wondering if you could find some way of cutting that off its source, so therefore that building really can't be used for the end use. And from my sort of limited experience of these things, some of the quality of the work that you see is done is generally of a poor standard. Now, someone signed this off, some building inspector has said that's fine, and yet, not all work seems to be carried out to the same level. And so I was just wondering the council has its own inspectors, it must have its inspectors that approves of as well. Could the council in some way say that if certain properties are going to be used for certain reasons, say that the inspector that signs it off must come from an approved list or something like that? Because some of the works that you see carried out, it doesn't look to me to be of a standard I would expect to see signed off at times. It shouldn't work better.
In answer to your second question about the quality of the work, that isn't something from a planning perspective that we would be able to look at. Obviously, building regulations and adhering to building regulations and a civic code from the Birmingham City Council's perspective, it may be that the work that they're doing doesn't necessarily require building regulations, especially if it's just some internal refurbishment of some very minor changes that are probably necessary to legalize properties to bring them into use. So although obviously in an ideal world we would expect there to be a high quality and standard of work, I don't think there's anything, certainly not within planning, and unless they trigger a building regulations breach, then we can't get involved.
What if they're in a conservation area?
Well, there's again, internal works don't require.
What if they damage, important sort of decorative Victorian art?
So if it's a listed building.
No, not unlisted, just conservation area.
But within a conservation area, there's obviously further controls as far as whether or not you require planning permission. If alterations are made externally.
Oh, yeah, it depends on the individual property.
Absolutely, yeah.
Deirdre, Councillor Oldham.
Thank you.
First question, yeah.
Sorry, Deirdre, you and just ask a supplementary or
just the first question.
Catching it at the outset.
Yes.
Essentially, yeah. So a lot of the complaints that we receive in enforcement are kind of before the horse has bolted. So the properties are undergoing some refurbishment. There's obviously concern in the locality, which is brought to our attention. So that kind of engages us as an enforcement service to go out there to find out from the very beginning what their intentions are. However, and this is something we come across, and it is a difficulty, and until that property is actually occupied and the people are in there, we can't put a stop to them carrying out.
But if you walked into a post office with a gun and didn't actually rob it, I mean, come on.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
We understand, and we can obviously see the intentions at a very early stage. But in terms of there being a breach, and I mean, what we would always do is obviously advise the owners that if they are intending to bring the property into use for a purpose that is likely to require planning permission, then there's no guarantees you're going to obtain this permission retrospectively. But because there is potential that the work they're carrying out could actually implement a legitimate use which is lawful, council can't put a barrier in the way at that stage. Obviously, at a later date, if they bring it into use for something that's unauthorised, unlawful, and unacceptable, then we can consider enforcement action. But that's
an anomaly, isn't it? Come on.
Well, I mean, I had one in our ward where a house was purchased, the level of alterations in the planning permission that was applied for in the roof space, it was only going to be one thing.
Yeah.
They denied that, the owners, of course. Residents were up in arms. Big response coming through. In the end, they didn't pursue it in the end, and the property was sold. You know what I mean?
I've got something even worse.
Yeah.
The next door neighbour got a copy of the plans which showed it was going to be a multi-use HMO, sent it to planning enforcement, and we got the same answer. So I'm not. That's why I'm angry, really. Not at you. I just inadequacy of the law. Deirdre, sorry to keep you waiting. I don't want to upset you.
That's all right. And I wanted to make 2 points. And the first one I wanted to make was about the retrospective planning permission, which is one of the things that absolutely infuriates me. And I understand that, okay, someone's put something up, which when they do put in planning permission, they will probably get planning permission for. But in the meantime, they have put it up without applying for planning permission. And we're always told by planning, can't do anything about it because they put in for planning permission and then they'll get it. Well, and I want to know, is that really true? Is it the law that says we can't do anything about it? Or is it Birmingham City Council's policy? Because if it's the latter, we could change it. We could say something like, okay, well, we are not going to even look at your planning application until you take out what you've done without planning permission. So I want to know, is it the law or is it our internal policies which could be changed? That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to talk about, when we're looking at those slides, and we got to the point E, which said, it won't result in, you've got to make sure it won't result in a loss of existing use that makes an important contribution to the city's plans and strategies. So affordable family housing is surely one of the things that we want to have. We're always saying there's not enough affordable family housing. I've got an estate, the bottom of Metchley Lane. They're modern 3-bedroom council houses. They're obviously former council houses because they got bought. They're obviously meant for families. They'd be ideal for families, and they're being all turned into multi-occupation, for which they're patently unsuitable. So that, of course, made me excited when I see that. But of course, that's not exempt accommodation, is it? We seem to have muddied the waters here between two things, HMOs and exempt accommodation, because exempt accommodation doesn't need planning permission, does it? So all these things are pointless. We want to know what can be done about exempt accommodation. And I did feel that there where I'm getting excited about something and then think, yeah, but it doesn't apply to this. Why are we talking about that? We want to do something about exempt. And I do feel that in lots of respects, not just in this meeting, but in all my dealings with them, planning fob you off, frankly. That's my opinion as a councillor. I get fed up with being fobbed off when my residents are really upset about things. And as you've just said, Chairman, clearly your residents are as well.
Yep. I think fobbed off is an understatement, actually. Yeah, James, never take these things personally, mate, all right? So,
yeah, I mean, talking about the law for retrospective planning applications, that is something that's in legislation to allow people to apply retrospectively. But It's always a matter of judging each case on its merits. So we can't take away that right. And if we were to serve an enforcement notice at an early stage before they started to operate, then that opens up all sorts of grounds as far as appealing against that enforcement notice.
So you take a low risk. So it is a low risk. Well, you could do it, but you
it depends on the kind of the impact and the harm associated with each individual case. So if something
What about over concentration then? If you know that there's several other HMOs in the area and another bloke or person does it without planning permission?
Well, HMOs are different, obviously. So if we're talking about HMOs, then they would all need planning permission. So then that's a breach of planning control if they don't obtain planning permission.
They can still go ahead and convert it without you taking action until it's occupied.
They can carry out the works,
yeah.
But we would obviously, if it's unlikely to obtain planning permission retrospectively, at that stage we can serve an enforcement notice.
How many have you served in the past 12 months, Jim?
With HMOs?
Yeah.
I haven't got those figures on them.
Okay. Roger.
Okay, so I've got a main point.
Sorry, I had to put my hand up again, so I just wanted to come back on what you said.
Yes, I was informed. I was let down badly. So, yes, you can ask a supplementary.
Well, it's about this retrospective, because he says yes, they've got the right to apply retrospectively. We're not denying that. My point is, if they choose to take that right, is there nothing we can say, such as, well, we're not going to listen to your planning application until you've taken that stuff down? You know, we know they've got the right to do it, but we could surely make life difficult. And it's all about making a deterrent, isn't it? Because as you say, you've got a landlord that does this again and again and again. We need to make life difficult for them.
The only option would be to serve an enforcement notice for every property that is currently undertaking work that would potentially result in a breach of planning control.
Brilliant, do it. Brilliant.
The vast majority do not result in a breach of planning control for supported exempt, because the legislation is there in favour of the developer as far as the supported exempt is concerned. And until that legislation is changed, the vast majority of those properties are not actually resulting in a breach of planning control. So there's no basis for us to stop them doing the work from an enforcement perspective if ultimately there's no breach of planning control, because they would have a right of appeal. And that appeal would be very, very, very simple, because they would appeal on the basis that there is no breach of planning control that has occurred. So we would be swamped with appeals, which would be unable.
I suppose you could argue when the conversion's taking place, you don't know whether it's going to be exempt.
Well, you don't know. No.
So that's your defence, basically. Yeah. I've given it for you. Roger.
Yeah, so my main point is what I felt was missing from the presentation was a final slide that says, so this is what needs to be changed. It seems to me, and I'm putting this forward as an answer, Sally, that you may agree or disagree with, but this is sort of what I was hoping for, is that in broad principle, what we want is exempt accommodation to be subject to the same controls as HMOs. If you agree with that, I would look to you as planning officers to come up with what is the mechanism to most effectively do that in a way that is least complicated, requires the least complicated changes in legislation, and then that would be hopefully our recommendation. So that's sort of what I felt that's where we need to get to, because it seems clear that that's the problem. We're talking about HMOs, these regulations, but as Julie said, exempt aren't subject to it. So what's the point of talking about it? And that is the fundamental solution to it. So that's the main point. The secondary point is on HMOs, where people. One thing you didn't sort of say was one of the things that people who have to apply for planning permission can currently say is, oh, it was an HMO before June 2020. So therefore, we just need a certificate of lawfulness. We don't actually need planning approval. And when that happens, because that effectively allows them to short circuit all these rules, just like the exempt situation does, do you actually undertake thorough checks that they actually were? I've got a planning application in ACOT Green at the moment where the application just says we converted to be an HMO on this particular date before June 2020, and that's just some of the evidence in the application. There's nothing else there that says it, and the neighbours dispute that. It's a 5-bed, there's no licence on the system, anything else. So do you actually go out and say, well, where is the proof of this? And if you can't provide clear proof that it was, we are therefore reported, we will turn this down and you will have to get planning approval.
Thanks, Councillor. The first question about what the ask is essentially, and the legislative changes. It's not we're going to have to change the legislation, and the simple thing would be
we can make
a change. Yeah, exactly. So the simple thing would be to change the definition of a HMO in the Housing Act, so that it doesn't exclude registered social landlord properties operated or managed by registered.
Well, there you are.
That is something that finds forward in the present.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. The second one about LDCs, they are scrutinised, and the council solicitors look at every lawful development application that comes in, and it's on a balance of probability. So if it's 51% stacked in favour in terms of the evidence that's brought forward that proves that they were operating prior to the introduction of the Article 4, which is obviously June 2020, then on that basis, in terms of tenancy agreements, council tax records, we have sworn affidavits, so there is evidence that's brought forward, and it has to be robust evidence, and it is tested. And we do go back to applicants where we don't feel that the evidence is robust enough. So it is scrutinised, and they can't just provide something that has no substance to it in order to obtain a lawful development certificate. However, obviously each case has its own set of evidence that we have to assess on a case-by-case basis.
Section 215, are you responsible for enforcing that?
In terms of amenity notices, yeah.
Yeah. How many have you issued in the last 12 months?
Again, I wouldn't be able to say exactly.
A lot or a few?
I'd say not very many.
Why is that?
The test as far as section 215 is concerned is
whose test, ours or?
No, in law, the test, and again, there is a right of appeal for the service of a section 215 notice, but in terms of section 215 notice, whatever it's been applied to has to be having an adverse impact on the amenity of the surrounding area.
So someone converting a property without planning permission to a HMO and leaving building rubble on the street and on the, I think that's a bit breach.
I wouldn't say that's section 215 territory, because it's part and parcel of that work that's going on.
So what if they finished the work and they just left it?
Well, again, that's a very kind of,
I can see why you're having this many sections.
I can explain what section.
No, I know, I've got it in front of me.
Yeah, and it's more applicable to derelict buildings.
Why is that? Is it that again just your interpretation?
It's not. No, that is essentially where.
Well, I've read it, and it doesn't mention it only applies to derelict buildings, James.
It's building or land that's having an adverse impact on the surrounding area.
Absolutely. So building rubble left for months and months and months has an adverse effect, I would argue.
But you can, sorry to help you out here, Tim, but I mean, my ward is right on butts, right up Staffordshire. You can see it time and time again on planning issues. And people went, no, builders, when they're talking about doing things, just know fine well. The other side of Rosemary Hill Road or something like that, you'll never get away with that in Staffordshire. And it's just common parlance. And there does seem to be a defensiveness,
yes,
lack of confidence. I don't know what it is in Birmingham. And
risk averse.
Yeah, exactly. And it's no personal, sort of quib. It's just an observation. And as us here, planting the corner for our residents wherever they are in the city, and it's a cross-party thing today. We just would like to see a bit more boom and sort of push. Is it around money there?
Yeah, I think you're right. Is your department got any awards coming up? No, I'm being serious. You're more interested in what other people say than the people living in the city say. That's what I get the impression of. And it's disappointing to say that come on, we've got to move on, and I'm getting wound up now, and I'm an old man and I can't. Okay, bigger picture. Jean, who's very young and still sprightly, and Dominic, who looks a bit worse for wear.
Got it back on there. Don't worry too much about the presentation because I'm very, very conscious of time. So I think we'll just make a few key points. I think just a couple of things that are quite important contextually is around some of the things that I don't think have been directly referenced today. Actually, one of the big things that got shelved in 2018 was massive supported housing reforms. There would have been, I mean, I think we were all agreeing there's no magic bullet to solve any of this, but actually way back in 2018, there was major reforms that were proposed that were to give local authorities control around the supported housing provision it had in the city. That had really huge pushback, primarily from our sector, not from our organisations personally, but that was a really big thing, and we've seen a lot of the things being exacerbated since that period of time. And I think that contextually is quite important to think what local authority colleagues have had to deal with since then. The second point, David briefly mentioned it, was about the supported housing benefit regulations. They were written in 1996, and I think at the time they were written to be temporary. We're now in 2021, the world has moved on. The things around lease-based providers, an umbrella model where you have private providers, they didn't exist then. Supported housing was very different. And I think when we're looking at what the asks are back to central government, this is really, really important because we know there's fears there about wholesale reform, but actually there are things we can do within the existing regulations that would really make a huge difference. One of the ones that has been referenced today is what we mean by care, support and supervision. The more than minimal is massively unhelpful to benefit colleagues. That could literally mean you're helping someone look for a job for an hour a week and you could technically qualify as exempt housing because that's more than minimal in terms of a general needs tenancies. Those type of things are really important. Also that we've got registered providers designated their accommodation as non-social housing. Well, I think that again, it doesn't allow the purview of the regulators to get directly engaged. It is co-regulation, which is a separate issue. I think all of those things really need to be looked at in terms of what the asks are. Just a final point, and Guy mentioned it in his presentation, I think the really important thing that's happening now is a supported housing needs assessment, which is looking at the needs that are in the city. I think there is a point that over the years, we've taken a lot of referrals from outside the city that have come in, which have caused problems. I know there's been a lot of work with probation colleagues and criminal justice, because frankly, referrals have been coming in from all over the country at various points. But I think the supported housing needs assessment is important. What it will throw up is that we've got really high concentration in certain areas. I think that's been articulated already today. But I think what it will show is that we don't need the amount that we've got now. So then it's what now? And I think one of the big tasks has to be a real direct engagement with providers to work on strategies around decommissioning and having a look at what their overall portfolios are. I'm not fully convinced that all of the boards of these organisations are fully grasp the situation that's here in the city. And actually, if they're working against the needs assessment and a local strategy, it'd be very, very odd. And I think that's some dialogue then that can be directly picked up with the regulators and others. So I just wanted to get kind of those key messages because I think the asks are so important here alongside the local strategy.
In essence, if we had a local strategy and we could show that a new provider doesn't fit in with our local strategy, the regulator, we can get in touch with the regulator and they can say yes or no.
Yeah, you'd be writing to the chair and the chief, I know, and say, why on earth are you going against our supported housing strategy? We've got huge saturation in this area for this style of provision.
We are developing one, aren't we?
We are.
We are. It's happening.
Thank you.
I don't want to sort of dilute the fact that we ideally need that sort of national regulatory powers to enforce what we need to do.
You need to do it quickly.
Yeah, this doesn't help David's team in the short term, but it's just that point that it gives additional tools if that's one of the asks that link to a research strategy.
Okay.
Gina?
Yeah, no, I just want to add, Birmingham's in the vanguard of this new model and this new approach. So you are out there and but there is concern nationally and there is concern regionally. So certainly within the combined authority, our other local authorities members there are now seeing this tip out. So you are there for a number of reasons that have been discussed today. Low, very low local housing.
We don't want an award.
No awards. rights, but you have low LHA levels, which really has shifted a lot of the private landlords into this model underneath it. So you are there. You are also operating with at least one hand tied behind your back, if not both, quite frankly, because the recommendations to make this fit have got to be to central government. The only reg you've got is that thin line in housing benefit regs, and actually that fails good housing benefit teams, because good housing benefit teams do operate within the law. It's the dodgy ones that don't. So actually, the fact whether you've got awards or not, the fact is, if you're a good provider in Birmingham and you're registered and you're a commissioned provider, it's great. The housing benefit service is really good, but it's that thin line that you have to. So for me, the recommendations coming out of this and all the work that's going on with the pilot have to inform what's recommended to central government, because there are significant changes required. The other thing is that will take time, because there is very little appetite in central government to tackle some of this, because one of the issues is the main priority, as we all know, is ending rough sleeping by 2024. If you tackle this sector in the way that's proposed, people will fall out. And other authorities and other parts of the country who have not met their need in the same way that Birmingham has always tried to, are sending people around, and they are coming to Birmingham, and they will fall out on the streets of Birmingham. So it is a complex issue. And I think we absolutely need central government support. You know, it's not about politics, it's about central government support and an understanding of how, because that money that David's talking about that is going into housing benefit and DWP is actually paying. Government are paying for the costs of poor accommodation for some of the most vulnerable people who are being failed. But you don't get that money. Whereas if the 2018 model that Dom said was the Birmingham proposal, which was rejected nationally by the sector, it was put forward by government, that would have taken that money back to the local authorities to commission the kind of support they need and meet the local needs.
I asked one of the providers who we interviewed part of this, if these unscrupulous people are doing it and can get housing benefit for their clients, why can't you? And they said, well, the difference is we only put our people in good accommodation.
Exactly.
We've got standards.
Exactly.
And those that haven't aren't bothered.
Exactly. And I think so many of us, and it's been a big shake-up for the registered provider sector on this, because if you're a registered provider, a conventional one, it was a badge of honour. You know, it was about standards, it was about meeting need. Then all of a sudden there's this new breed coming in, who it's a shock. Not even having, some of them, 95% of their stock, they haven't even got a social housing, so the regulator doesn't look at it. The regulator can't oversee it because it's not in a social housing. You're still having to pay the exempt rents.
I found it really interesting what you're saying. So, I mean, could Birmingham itself put people in exempt accommodation? Could Birmingham itself have its good provider list that could be a set of criteria to be agreed, and then say that we will only put people in this good list?
In effect, that will happen through the work that Guy referenced with the quality standards and the Charter of Rights. So it's providers that are doing well in both of those things that will get statutory referrals and through the commission hubs in the city as well. So in effect, it will, in that, even in the non-commission space where there's a recognition there is a need for it, the referrals will happen to good, because the only way you'll stop this long term is if referrals dry up, and therefore, the cash dries up in terms of these services.
So quickly reinforce that, yes. So the approach is adopting an accreditation scheme. So quality standards awards are kite marks for good providers. They get assessed against those providers on an ongoing basis. And we get the buy-in from the statutory referring agencies. You only refer to those providers. That's the kind of approach that we can try and take with the quality standards.
And I think just to finish the point that I think Jean was making and the points that have been made, I think it's really important to look at where we're looking at actually new legislation, but actually there's some quicker wins with improving the existing regulations, which are a much less harder sell to government, because I think all good providers will have no problem with you saying this is what good care support supervision looks like. Sure. So there should be the pushback in the sector that we had back in.
So it looks like we're going to have short-term, medium-term and longer-term recommendations.
And you'll need to keep if you lose the resource that you've currently got, I know the point was made earlier on, this will take time nationally. And if you lose the resource you've currently got, it's all going to get worse.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you everybody who's participated. The next section, we're half an hour. Does everybody want to continue on till 1:30 and deal with it now, or do members want to do the recap and next steps at a future meeting? I'm in your hands.
Let's carry on, Chair. That's my view.
Gotta go.
My view was the opposite. I think it's so important that it's going to need more than 20 minutes, half an hour discussion.
I agree with Deirdre. I just think there's too much.
Yeah.
I'm just keen to get to some draft recommendations. I feel like I've been having the same conversation 10 years. I'm just keen to get to some draft recommendations. Even if we come back and revisit them.
Next week, or the week after, how would you feel? That's not too long to wait, is it?
I'll take your lead as always, Chair.
Okay. Well, I'm intellectually exhausted. As I say, I'm an old man. My brain cells aren't what they used to be. I agree with Deirdre and others that it is a very, very important issue. And for the sake of a few days, and I'm talking about a few days, if Emma can get everybody together, and we might even do it remotely to make it easier, because, looking at how many members are remote and how many are here, it may well be that we do it remotely to make it much more accessible. Are you happy with that?
Chair, I think I'll do my best to get into the next meeting because I just could not hear half of it today.
Okay.
The live streaming was just awful. I'm going to have to be present for the next one because I just can't concentrate on. I've been shunted out of Teams 3 times. I can't just reflect on things. So I'm going to actually try and come in.
I think it's.
I understand others.
That wasn't the same for everyone. And maybe that's an issue with Debbie's computer, but I haven't had a problem with that. The only problem I would say was when the screen froze with the slides on, because that was awkward until I realised they'd come on email.
Okay.
All right. It's been all right.
I was the same. I didn't have any issues apart from the presentation screening. I wasn't thrown out of the meeting at all throughout. So I think it might be a problem with your internet, Debbie.
Maybe not. I don't know.
The chair speaking now. Can I ask that it might be better, Debbie? We think it might be the Wi-Fi in this building rather than anything else, but because you've never had a problem when we've had meetings remotely before, have you?
No, and I've shut down things I had in email to make sure. I've definitely got working internet, so I can't.
Right.
Don't know.
Can I thank everybody? Can I thank everybody who's participated? If anybody had any doubts about the quality of officers we've got in Birmingham City Council, I think today it's demonstrated that everybody's at the top of their game. So thank you very much indeed, everybody who's participated, and to my charitable sector colleagues, who I hold in tremendously high esteem as I work for the charitable sector myself. I know what poor relations you are compared to these well-paid, well-resourced statutory officers. So thank you, and for members and everybody else, members of the public who came, thank you.
Julie just wanted to
Yeah, just very, very quickly, I just wanted to say thank you very much to Scrutiny for this piece of work, and again to echo your views about the officers here. I think they've absolutely shown that they are doing their very best within the regulations that we have presented to us, and I think Jean actually captured very much and very clearly what we need to do from a corporate perspective and a national perspective, and I think that we need to take on board how we actually move forward and strengthen those regulations and lobby government to strengthen regulations to give the local authorities more powers to ensure that we drive up the standards within this sector. So just want to say thank you to the Scrutiny Committee and welcome your report and recommendations.
Thank you all very much indeed. I'm now going to close the meeting. I look forward to seeing you in around about 7 to 10 days' time when we will have that recap. Thank you very much indeed, everybody.